There is a continent at the bottom of the world where something extraordinary happened. A place so ancient, so isolated, so vast and indifferent to human fragility that the people who chose to call it home, or perhaps who were carried to its shores by currents and courage and chance, had to become something entirely new. Not different in the way we use that word casually, as if it means merely unusual or interesting or worth a second glance. Different in the deepest biological and cognitive and spiritual sense of the word. Different in the way that only 50,000 years of separation from the rest of our species can produce. Different in ways that science is still struggling to measure and language is still struggling to name. This is the story of the first Australians, the most ancient living culture on Earth, and the quiet, slow, relentless process by which the world remade them, and they remade themselves, into something the rest of humanity had never seen and will never fully understand. If this is the kind of content that slows your mind and opens something in you, something that has been waiting all day for a little silence, then please consider subscribing to this channel and joining us on Patreon, where every story goes a little deeper and the nights last a little longer. Now, close your eyes if you can, let your shoulders drop. We have a very long time to spend together, and none of it needs to be rushed. There is a question that sits at the heart of human prehistory, quiet, stubborn, unresolved, and it goes something like this. We know that all modern humans share a common origin. We know that every person alive on Earth today carries within them the genetic inheritance of a small group of ancestors who walked out of Africa somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 years ago. We know the broad strokes of what happened next: a slow dispersal across continents, a gradual filling of the world's available spaces, a long process of adaptation to new climates and new pressures and new forms of survival. And yet, when we look carefully at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia, the people who arrived on that continent at the beginning of all of this, or very nearly so, we find something that does not fit neatly into the story we thought we knew. We find a population whose genome contains sequences found nowhere else on Earth in such high concentrations. We find a cognitive architecture shaped by a landscape so ancient and so demanding that it produced navigation systems and memory techniques and social structures unlike anything that emerged in Europe or Asia or the Americas. We find a people whose isolation was so complete, so unbroken, for so long, that by the time the rest of the world arrived on their shores, they had become, in certain measurable and verifiable ways, a different expression of what it means to be human. This is not a story about racial hierarchy. It is not a story about superiority or inferiority. Those are the wrong categories entirely. The categories of a frightened, insecure colonial worldview that we are still slowly learning to let go of. This is a story about time and pressure and adaptation and evolution. It is a story about what happens when a group of human beings spends 50,000 years in a place that asks everything of them. It is a story about the deep biological and cultural and cognitive inheritance that emerges when a people develops, largely undisturbed, in the most ancient landscape on the surface of the planet. The Australian continent is old in a way that is very difficult to hold in the mind. It is not merely old the way a medieval cathedral is old, or old the way a Roman ruin is old. It is old in geological time, the kind of time that makes the dinosaurs feel recent. The central rock formations of Australia have been sitting in roughly the same place for hundreds of millions of years. The soils are ancient and depleted. The rivers do not behave like rivers elsewhere. The seasons do not work the way seasons work on other continents. The plants evolve their own strategies for survival that look, to a European eye, almost perverse in their strangeness. And the people who have lived here for 50,000 years, the people who learned every one of the continent's secrets, who named every waterhole and every sandstone shelf and every subtle shift in the direction of the wind, they did not emerge from this experience unchanged. They could not have. Nothing lives in a place for that long without becoming, in some essential way, a part of it. What follows is an attempt to trace that becoming, to sit with the science and the archaeology and the genetics and the oral traditions, and to ask, as honestly and as carefully as we can, what does 50,000 years of Australian life do to a human being? What does it produce? What does it demand? What does it, in the end, reveal about the astonishing flexibility and range of our species, and about the particular, irreplaceable, and still largely unmeasured gifts of the world's oldest living culture? We will move through this slowly. There is no need to hurry. The first thing to understand is the crossing itself, the initial act of arrival that set everything else in motion. Sometime between 65,000 and 75,000 years ago, a group of human beings stood at the edge of a body of water, and decided to cross it. We do not know exactly how many of them there were. We do not know whether they built watercraft deliberately or whether they were carried by accident on floating debris during a storm. We do not know whether they made the crossing in a single generation, or whether it took several attempts across several decades before a viable founding population was established on the other side. What we know, with a confidence that has only grown stronger as genetic and archaeological methods have improved, is that it happened. That human beings, at the very beginning of the Great Dispersal from Africa, found their way to the continent we now call Australia, and that their descendants have been living there ever since. This is, in itself, one of the most extraordinary facts in all of human prehistory. At the time of the crossing, there was no such thing as a human civilization anywhere on Earth. The agricultural revolution was still 40,000 years in the future. The construction of Göbekli Tepe, long considered one of the oldest monumental structures in the world, was still 50,000 years away. The wheel had not been invented. Writing had not been invented. The first permanent settlements in the Levant were tens of thousands of years from being built. The people who made the crossing to Australia were among the most ancient human beings who ever lived. They were living in a world that is almost completely beyond our capacity to imagine, and they did something that no human being had ever done before. They looked out across a body of water that was too wide to see across, too wide to know what lay on the other side, and they crossed it anyway. The body of water they crossed was not the same as it is today. During the last glacial maximum, sea levels were considerably lower than they are now, perhaps as much as 120 meters lower at the very coldest periods, though the crossing likely occurred before the deepest freeze. What is now the Timor Sea and the waters between the islands of Southeast Asia and the Australian mainland was, at the time of the first crossing, a narrower set of straits and channels, but it was never land. Even at the lowest sea levels, the final stretch of open water between Sonderland, the landmass that connected the islands of Indonesia, and Sahul, the landmass that combined Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania into a single continent, required an ocean crossing of at least 90 kilometers, and possibly considerably more. This was not a shoreline that could be seen from the other side. The people who made this crossing had to commit to the unknown. They had to go out onto open water with no guarantee of what lay beyond it, guided perhaps by observations of birds, or the behavior of ocean currents, or a kind of deep navigational intuition that we are only beginning to understand as a human cognitive capacity. The fact that they made it, that the crossing was successful, that a founding population was established, that this population survived and thrived and grew and spread across the entire continent over the millennia that followed, tells us something important about the cognitive and social capabilities of the first Australians. These were not people who stumbled onto a new continent by accident. They were people who possessed the navigational intelligence, the collective planning capacity, the boat building or raft building ability, the knowledge of currents and weather and open water sailing, to cross a gap that no human being had ever crossed before. They arrived in Australia not as refugees or wanderers, but as skilled navigators, competent ocean voyagers, people who had already spent generations learning to read the sea. And then, on the other side of that crossing, they encountered a continent unlike anything that existed in the world from which they had come. The continent of Sahul, the greater Australia that included what is now New Guinea to the north and Tasmania to the south, was massive. It was rich in ways that Africa and the coastal regions of Asia were rich, but also strange in ways that were entirely new. The megafauna that the first Australians encountered were unlike anything in the rest of the world. Giant wombats the size of hippopotamuses, marsupial lions, enormous flightless birds, lizards 12 meters long, diprotodons moving in herds across grasslands that no human eye had ever seen. The first Australians were not the apex predators of this landscape. They were newcomers to an ecology that had evolved for millions of years without them. And in order to survive, in order to learn what was edible and what was poisonous, what could be hunted and what could not be approached, where the water was and how to find it when the surface was dry, they had to develop an intimacy with this landscape that was unlike anything they had known before. This process of learning, this deep, slow, multi-generational accumulation of knowledge about an entirely new world, is one of the foundational forces that shaped the first Australians into something different from the people they had been before the crossing. The knowledge they needed was not the knowledge that could be carried across the sea. It had to be built from scratch, trial by error, generation by generation, observation by observation, failure by failure, until it was complete enough to sustain a population across every ecological zone of a continent larger than Europe. The people who emerged from this process, after 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years of learning, were not the same people who had made the crossing. They had been changed by the continent. They had been shaped by its demands. And those shapes, those particular adaptations, cognitive and physical and cultural, are what we are here to explore. Let us begin with the genes. The genetic story of the first Australians is one of the most complex and contested and revelatory chapters in all of human genomics. For a long time, the prevailing model of human prehistory held that all non-African populations were descended from a single out-of-Africa migration event, a single founding population that left the African continent and then gradually dispersed eastward and westward and northward into the empty spaces of the world. Under this model, the Aboriginal Australians was simply an early branch of this dispersal. The people who had travelled the farthest east and south and then been cut off from the rest of humanity by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. Their genetic distinctiveness under this model was simply the product of isolation, of being separated from the gene flow that continued to reshape populations in Africa, Europe, and Asia for tens of thousands of years after the founding population was established. This model is not entirely wrong, but it is, we now know, considerably incomplete. The genetic picture that has emerged from the last 2 decades of ancient DNA analysis and modern genomic sequencing is far more complex, far more interesting, and far more illuminating about the deep history of our species than the simple out-of-Africa model ever suggested. The first and perhaps most striking finding is one we will return to in more detail shortly, but it deserves to be named here at the outset. Aboriginal Australians carry a higher proportion of Denisovan ancestry than any other population on Earth. The Denisovans were a group of archaic humans, closely related to the Neanderthals but distinct from them, who lived across a vast territory stretching from Siberia to Southeast Asia. We know them primarily from fragmentary fossil evidence and, remarkably, from ancient DNA extracted from a tiny finger bone found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. The Denisovans interbred with the ancestors of modern humans at some point before or during the out-of-Africa dispersal. And the genetic legacy of that interbreeding, Denisovan sequences woven into the modern human genome, is carried today by populations across Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Australia. Aboriginal Australians carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan-derived DNA, compared to roughly 1% in most mainland East Asian populations, and effectively 0 in European populations. This is not a small difference. This is a genomic inheritance that speaks to a history of human archaic contact that we are only beginning to understand. But the Denisovan story is only part of the genetic picture. What is perhaps even more remarkable is the degree of internal differentiation within the Aboriginal Australian population itself. Because the continent of Australia is large and diverse, and because the founding populations that spread across it from whatever initial landing point or points they arrived at had very limited contact with one another across vast distances for very long periods of time, regional populations within Australia had already begun to diverge from one another genetically before the continent was isolated by rising sea levels. The result is that within the Aboriginal Australian population, already one of the most genomically ancient populations of modern humans alive today, there is a degree of genetic diversity that reflects tens of thousands of years of local adaptation and genetic drift. Communities in the Western Desert carry different frequencies of certain genetic variants than communities on Cape York. Desert populations show different patterns of selection pressure than coastal populations. The genetic landscape of Aboriginal Australia is not a single homogeneous block. It is a mosaic of ancient, regionally differentiated lineages, each carrying its own particular signature of the pressures that shaped it. This internal genetic diversity has enormous implications for how we understand the first Australians. It means, first of all, that the people who arrived on the continent were not a single culturally homogeneous group. Or, if they began as one, they quickly diversified in response to the different demands of different environments. It means that the 50,000 years of occupation represented in Aboriginal Australian genetics is not a single flat line of unchanged ancestry, but a complex, branching, regionally specific story of adaptation and change. It means that the first Australians are not simply an old population. They are a genomically rich population, carrying within their collective genome a record of human prehistory that cannot be found anywhere else on Earth with comparable depth or clarity. There is another genetic dimension to this story that is less well known but equally extraordinary. Studies of the Y chromosome lineages and mitochondrial DNA of Aboriginal Australians have consistently found extremely deep roots, lineages that branch off from the main tree of human genetic diversity at points that are, in some cases, more ancient than those found in any other living population. What this means, in practical terms, is that the genetic diversity found within the Aboriginal Australian population reflects a longer period of local evolution than almost any other population in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. The people who have been living in Australia for 65,000 or more years have been accumulating local genetic adaptations, local drift, local responses to selection pressure for longer than the ancestors of Europeans and East Asians have been living in their current locations. They are, in a very literal genomic sense, the product of the longest continuous process of human evolution outside of Africa that we have documented. This fact should give us pause. It should make us reconsider what we mean when we talk about human diversity. The conventional view of human genetic diversity tends to focus on the differences between continental populations, between Africans and Europeans and Asians and Australians, as if these populations all began at roughly the same point, and then diverged over similar periods of time. But the first Australians did not begin their divergence from the rest of humanity, at the same point in time as the divergence between Europeans and East Asians. They began it earlier, much earlier. The genetic distance between Aboriginal Australians and other non-African populations reflects a depth of separation that should not be understated. These are human beings, fully and unambiguously modern human beings, members of our species in every meaningful sense, but they have been on a separate evolutionary path in a radically different environment for a period of time that exceeds the entire history of agriculture. They could not have emerged from this experience unchanged, and they did not. Among the genetic inheritances that make the first Australians biologically distinct from other human populations, none has attracted more scientific attention in recent years than the question of Denisovan DNA. We touched on this briefly in the previous section, but the story deserves a much fuller treatment, because it is not merely a story about ancient interbreeding. It is a story about the survival of ancient cognitive and physiological adaptations that may have been crucial to the survival of the first humans in the Australian environment. The Denisovans, as we have already noted, were an archaic human population, a sister group of the Neanderthals, descended from a common ancestor with them somewhere around 400,000 years ago. Like the Neanderthals, they had been living in their range for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived. Unlike the Neanderthals, who occupied Europe and Western Asia, the Denisovans occupied a vast territory stretching from Siberia to Southeast Asia, a range that, crucially, overlapped with the migration routes that the ancestors of the first Australians would have taken on their way to the continent. The Denisovans had been in Southeast Asia, and possibly island Southeast Asia, for an enormous span of time before modern humans arrived. And when modern humans arrived, something happened between them, something we describe with the clinical word interbreeding, but which, of course, involved actual people, actual encounters, actual lives lived at the boundary between two kinds of human being. The genetic evidence for Denisovan admixture in the ancestors of the first Australians is robust and has been replicated across multiple independent studies. What varies is the interpretation of what this Denisovan genetic legacy actually contributed, what it did functionally for the modern human populations that carried it into Australia and then retained it there at higher frequencies than anywhere else in the world. One of the most compelling findings in this area concerns the immune system. Certain Denisovan-derived genetic variants that are found at elevated frequencies in Aboriginal Australians and Melanesian populations appear to be involved in immune function, specifically in the regulation of immune responses to pathogens. This is not surprising. The Denisovans had been living in tropical and subtropical Southeast Asia for potentially hundreds of thousands of years, during which time they had been exposed to and developed immunity to a wide range of local pathogens. When modern humans arrived in this environment, carrying with them an immune repertoire shaped by African pathogens, they were suddenly exposed to entirely new infectious threats. The Denisovan-derived immune variants that entered the modern human gene pool through interbreeding may have provided a ready-made solution to some of these threats, a borrowed immune history that helped the newcomers survive an environment that was, in immunological terms, deeply unfamiliar. But the Denisovan contribution may not have been limited to immune function. There is growing evidence that Denisovan-derived genetic variants in Australasian populations are associated with traits related to metabolism and body composition, variants that may have helped the early inhabitants of Australia and New Guinea regulate energy balance in environments where food availability was unpredictable, and the metabolic demands of thermoregulation were significant. There is also some emerging evidence for Denisovan-derived variants in genes associated with brain development and neurological function, though this is a more controversial area of research, and the functional significance of these variants is not yet well understood. What is clear, however, is that the Denisovan genetic legacy in Aboriginal Australians is not evolutionary noise, not merely the accidental debris of an ancient encounter between two kinds of human being. At least some of it is functional. At least some of it has been retained under positive selection, meaning that individuals who carried these variants survived and reproduced at higher rates than individuals who did not over many thousands of years, in the specific environment of Australia and the surrounding region. The Denisovan inheritance was useful. It helped the first Australians survive. And in helping them survive, it became part of them. Part of the biological toolkit that makes the first Australians, at a genomic level, genuinely different from the rest of humanity. There is something quietly astonishing about this. The Denisovans as a people are gone. They left no known descendants who are entirely Denisovan. Their culture, their language, their social structures, all of this is beyond recovery. All that remains of them, in any direct sense, is a handful of fossil fragments and the ancient DNA that can be extracted from them. And yet, in a very real sense, the Denisovans are not entirely gone. A part of them lives on. It lives on in the genomes of the Aboriginal Australians and the peoples of Melanesia, in the immune genes and metabolic genes, and possibly the neurological genes that they contributed to the modern human lineage, and that have been preserved and selected for across tens of thousands of years in the Australian environment. The first Australians are in part Denisovan, and the Denisovans in that same part are still among us. This is one of the more poignant facts in all of human prehistory, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. It is worth letting the silence around it be complete. The story of human evolution is not a story of simple replacement, of one type of human being swept away and replaced by a superior model. It is a story of encounters and mergers and inheritances, of genomic conversations across species boundaries that we are only now beginning to read. The first Australians sit at a particularly rich node in this story. They are the inheritors not just of the African ancestors who gave rise to all modern humans, but of the Denisovan ancestors who shaped the biological response to tropical Asia and beyond. They are a palimpsest, a document written over by time, in which the oldest layers are not erased but incorporated, made part of the new writing. When the first detailed morphological studies of Aboriginal Australian skeletal remains were conducted in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were almost invariably interpreted through the lens of a racial hierarchy, a framework that ranked human populations according to their supposed proximity to European physical ideals, and that read physical difference as evidence of evolutionary inferiority. This framework was not only morally monstrous, it was also scientifically illiterate. The physical traits that distinguished Aboriginal Australian skulls and skeletons from European ones were not evidence of primitiveness or arrested development. They were evidence of adaptation, of a human lineage that had been subject to different selection pressures in a different environment for a very long time. Let us be clear about what the morphological evidence actually shows, stripped of the colonial interpretive framework that was imposed upon it for so long. Aboriginal Australian skulls are, on average, somewhat more robust than the skulls of most other modern human populations. They tend to have more prominent brow ridges, more pronounced jaw musculature, and somewhat thicker cranial bones than, for example, European or East Asian populations. These traits were interpreted by 19th century anthropologists as signs of primitiveness, as evidence that Aboriginal Australians were closer to the archaic human lineages that modern humans had replaced. But this interpretation was wrong in almost every detail. The robustness of Aboriginal Australian skull morphology is not a sign of primitiveness. It is a sign of dietary and biomechanical adaptation, of a population that, over very many generations, processed extremely tough and fibrous foods using their teeth and jaws as tools in ways that populations with access to processed or cooked foods did not. The Australian diet in the pre-contact period included an enormous range of tough, fibrous plant materials, seeds that had to be ground between hard stones before they could be eaten, tubers that required prolonged chewing, plant corms and bulbs with a texture that placed considerable mechanical stress on the jaw. It also included large animals that were butchered with stone tools and consumed in ways that made significant demands on the teeth. Over many thousands of years, these dietary demands produce selection pressure for robust jaw musculature, strong teeth, and the kind of cranial architecture that supports heavy chewing loads. The morphological robustness of Aboriginal Australian skulls is not an ancestral trait retained from archaic forebears. It is a derived trait, an adaptation to a specific kind of diet in a specific kind of environment. There are other morphological features of interest. Body proportion in Aboriginal Australian populations shows significant regional variation that reflects adaptation to local climates. Desert-living Aboriginal Australians tend toward the linearity predicted by Bergman's and Allen's rules for hot, arid environments, tall, slender bodies with long limbs that maximize surface area for heat dissipation. Coastal and more southerly populations show somewhat different proportions. These are not random variations. They are the signatures of bodies being shaped, generation by the thermal demands of different Australian environments. There is also the question of eye morphology. Aboriginal Australians have among the highest measured rates of emmetropia, normal, uncorrected vision, of any population that has been studied. Myopia, the most common refractive error in most industrialized populations, is extremely rare in traditional Aboriginal communities. This is almost certainly an adaptation to a lifestyle that required acute long-distance vision, for hunting, for navigation across vast landscapes, for reading subtle signs of animal presence and water availability across enormous distances. The eye, over time, was shaped by the demands of the land. None of these physical adaptations are unique in kind. Every human population shows morphological adaptations to its specific environmental context. The populations of the high-altitude Andes have larger lung capacities and enhanced oxygen-carrying efficiency in their blood. The populations of the Arctic have metabolic adaptations to high-fat diets and cold temperatures. The populations of sub-Saharan Africa show a range of body proportions and pigmentation patterns adapted to intense equatorial sun. Physical adaptation to environment is the universal condition of our species. What makes the Aboriginal Australian case distinctive is not the existence of physical adaptation, but its depth and its duration. 50,000 years of selective pressure in an environment as demanding and as specific as Australia's is a very long time. It is long enough to produce adaptations that are not merely superficial variations on a common human theme, but genuine, measurable, statistically significant departures from the average expression of human physical traits. There is something else worth noting here, something that the morphological studies of the 19th century missed entirely because it was not visible in bones and skulls. The most significant adaptations of the first Australians were not primarily physical, they were cognitive, they were cultural, they were social. The most extraordinary things that 50,000 years in Australia produced were not changes in jaw morphology or body proportion or eye structure. They were changes in the way human minds organized information, navigated space, remembered the past, and transmitted knowledge across generations. These are the adaptations that we have barely begun to understand, and they are the ones that we will spend the most time exploring. But before we go there, we need to spend a little time with the body, with the physiology, because the body too was changed by Australia in ways that are, when you look at them carefully, quite remarkable. The Australian immune system is its own chapter in the story of human evolution, a chapter that, like so much else in Aboriginal Australian biology, has been shaped by two distinct forces that pull in different directions. On one hand, there is the extraordinary depth of local adaptation. 50,000 years of exposure to Australian pathogens, Australian parasites, and Australian environmental antigens has produced, in the Aboriginal Australian immune system, a highly specific and finely calibrated response to the threats that actually existed in pre-contact Australia. On the other hand, there is the catastrophic vulnerability that this very specificity created when contact with European diseases, diseases for which the Aboriginal Australian immune system had no preparation whatsoever, arrived after 1788. Let us begin with the adaptation, because the adaptation is extraordinary. The Aboriginal Australian environment before European contact was not pathogen-free. The continent harbored its own suite of infectious agents, parasites, and environmental antigens, some of them specific to Australia, some of them shared with the broader Asian and Pacific region, all of them pressures that shaped immune gene frequencies in the populations that lived with them for 50,000 years. The result is a pattern of immune gene variation in Aboriginal Australian populations that is genuinely distinct from that found in other populations. A pattern that reflects, at the molecular level, the specific immunological challenges of life in Australia. Some of the most interesting immune adaptations in Aboriginal Australians concern responses to parasitic infection. Intestinal parasites were a constant feature of life in pre-contact Australia, as they were everywhere in the world where human populations lived in close contact with the soil and with animals. Over many generations, the Aboriginal Australian immune system was shaped by selection for efficient parasite resistance, for the kinds of immune responses that control parasitic infection without causing excessive collateral damage to the host's own tissues. This balance between parasite control and self-protection is one of the most demanding challenges that immune systems face, and the fine-tuning of this balance over tens of thousands of years in the specific parasite environment of Australia has produced immune parameters that look, in modern immunological testing, quite different from the parameters found in European populations. There is also the question of autoimmune disease. Modern Aboriginal Australians, when living in more traditional contexts, show very low rates of certain autoimmune diseases, conditions like multiple sclerosis and type 1 diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis, that are common in European populations. The reasons for this are complex and not fully understood. But one contributing factor may be the so-called hygiene hypothesis, the idea that immune systems shaped by prolonged exposure to parasites and microbial diversity are less likely to misdirect their activity toward the body's own tissues. An immune system that has spent 50,000 years learning to recognize actual threats, real parasites, real pathogens, real environmental challenges, may be less prone to the kind of misdirected activity that underlies autoimmune disease. The Aboriginal Australian immune system learned, over a very long time, to aim accurately. It learned from the land what was dangerous and what was not. And this learning, encoded in the frequencies of immune genes across generations, became part of the biological inheritance that distinguished the first Australians from the rest of humanity. Then came 1788. Then came the ships, the diseases that arrived with European colonization: smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis, whooping cough, scarlet fever, were diseases for which Aboriginal Australians had no genetic preparation whatsoever. These were not merely unfamiliar pathogens. They were pathogens that had co-evolved with European populations for hundreds or, in some cases, thousands of years, during which time European immune systems had been progressively shaped by selection for resistance. By the time these diseases arrived in Australia, the European populations that carried them had been whittled down, generation by generation, pandemic by pandemic, to the survivors, the people whose immune systems could mount some kind of effective response. Aboriginal Australians had not been through this selection process. They arrived at first contact with immune systems that were, in every relevant respect, entirely naive. The consequences were catastrophic beyond any easy description. Smallpox alone, which reached the Australian east coast within months of first European contact in 1788, and may have preceded it, travelling overland from previous contact points, killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of affected communities in some areas. This is not an unusual mortality rate for a naive population encountering a new pathogen. It is consistent with the mortality rates seen in other indigenous populations encountering European diseases for the first time. But in its scale and speed, in the sheer biological devastation that it represented, it stands as one of the great tragedies in human history. And it is a tragedy that has a specifically evolutionary dimension. The Aboriginal Australian immune system, so exquisitely adapted to the challenges of 50,000 years of Australian life, was not adapted to this. It could not have been. Nothing in its long history had prepared it for what came next. The immunological vulnerability of Aboriginal Australians to European diseases is often cited as evidence of biological weakness, of an immune system that was, in some fundamental sense, inferior. This interpretation is not merely offensive, it is wrong. An immune system is not strong or weak in any absolute sense. It is calibrated to its environment. The Aboriginal Australian immune system was calibrated to Australia, to the actual, specific, real threats that existed there over 50,000 years. It was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily well calibrated to that environment. That it was not calibrated to the diseases of a completely different continent with a completely different pathogen history is not a weakness. It is simply the consequence of having been somewhere else. Now, we come to the part of the story that is, in some ways, the most remarkable and the most difficult to convey in the language of Western science, because the things we need to talk about here are things that Western science has only recently begun to take seriously. We are talking about the cognitive adaptations of the first Australians, the extraordinary capacities of mind that 50,000 years in Australia produced, the navigational intelligence and the memory architecture and the spatial reasoning abilities that allowed a relatively small human population to learn, inhabit, and manage one of the largest and most challenging landscapes on Earth. Let us start with navigation, because navigation is something we can measure, and the measurements are striking. Human beings, as a species, have excellent spatial reasoning abilities relative to other animals. We can build and maintain mental maps of our environment, track our position relative to landmarks, and navigate through complex terrain without getting lost. These abilities are found in all human populations, but they vary enormously in their development and their precision. And when researchers have conducted systematic studies of navigational ability in traditional Aboriginal Australian populations, people who learned to read the Australian landscape in the way their ancestors had for tens of thousands of years, they have consistently found navigational capacities that exceed, by a significant margin, those found in urban Western populations tested on the same tasks. This should not be surprising. The demands of navigation in the Australian outback are extreme. The landscape is vast, flat, and largely featureless to an untrained eye. The landmarks that exist are subtle. Slight variations in vegetation, changes in soil color, the presence or absence of certain bird species, the angle of shadows at particular times of day. There are no mountains to navigate by in most of the interior. There are no rivers that run in predictable directions year-round. The waterholes that mean the difference between life and death can be hundreds of kilometers apart, and many of them are invisible until you are almost upon them. To navigate this landscape reliably, to move through it in the way that traditional Aboriginal Australians moved through it, covering enormous distances on foot across terrain that would defeat any GPS-dependent modern traveler, required a spatial intelligence of a very high order. And this intelligence was not innate, in the sense of being present from birth without cultivation. It was the product of systematic training, beginning in childhood, in which the young were taught to attend to the landscape in particular ways, to notice particular kinds of information, to build and update mental maps of extraordinary detail and precision. The cognitive architecture that this training produced, the particular way that traditional Aboriginal Australians organized spatial information in memory and retrieved it for practical use, is different from the spatial cognition of people who have grown up in grid layout cities with GPS navigation on their phones. Not better in every context, not inferior in any fundamental sense, different, adapted to the demands of a specific environment in ways that are, on reflection, exactly what we should expect 50,000 years of selection and training in a particular landscape to produce. But navigation is only the beginning. What is even more remarkable than the navigational abilities of the first Australians is the memory system that supports and encompasses those abilities. A system so sophisticated, so comprehensive, and so far beyond the capacities of most modern Western memory techniques that it is still being studied with genuine astonishment by cognitive scientists and memory researchers. The system is most commonly discussed under the name of the Songlines, and we will devote an entire section to them shortly. But even before we get there, it is worth pausing on the broader cognitive picture that the memory research reveals. Traditional Aboriginal Australian cultures developed over tens of thousands of years a set of memory techniques and mnemonic systems that allowed them to encode and reliably transmit enormous quantities of information. Geographic, ecological, social, historical, cosmological, across hundreds of generations, without writing, without any form of external storage technology beyond the marks they made on stone and bark. The information preserved in this way included precise navigational data about the entire continental landscape, detailed knowledge of the life histories and behaviors of thousands of plant and animal species, comprehensive genealogical records tracing family relationships across many generations, complex legal and social codes governing land ownership and dispute resolution, and an elaborate cosmological framework mapping the entire physical world onto a set of narrative and musical structures that encoded geographical information in easily memorable form. This is not a primitive information system. This is not a simple oral tradition of the kind that every human culture maintains. This is a technological achievement of the first order, a solution to the problem of long-term information storage and transmission that is, in its own way, as sophisticated as writing, and that has the specific advantage of being distributed across an entire community, rather than dependent on a centralized archive that can be destroyed. The cognitive architecture required to maintain and operate this system, the particular organization of memory and attention and social coordination that it demands, is the product of 50,000 years of development and refinement. And it is, as we have already suggested, one of the things that makes the first Australians cognitively distinct from the rest of humanity, not in any absolute sense of superiority or inferiority, but in the specific measurable sense that their minds were shaped by time and selection and cultural pressure to do certain things with exceptional fluency. To understand the songlines, we need first to understand the landscape they were created to map and the problem they were invented to solve. The problem is this: how do you transmit precise navigational information across generations in a culture without writing, across a continent the size of Australia? It is a harder problem than it looks. Geographical information is among the most difficult kinds of information to encode reliably in purely verbal form. Place names help, but place names alone are not enough. You also need distances, directions, sequences of landmarks, information about the character of each location, whether it has water, what season the water is available, what plants grow near it, what dangers it presents. You need this information for thousands of locations spread across millions of square kilometers of terrain. And you need it to remain accurate and accessible not just in this generation, but in every generation for as far into the future as anyone can think. Because the land does not forgive navigation errors, and a group that loses track of where the water is, or takes the wrong route between two distant points, may not survive to pass anything on. The songlines are the solution to this problem. They are, at their most basic technical level, a system for encoding geographical and ecological information in musical and narrative form. Each songline is a sequence of songs, a long interlocking series of melodic phrases and lyrics that describes a route across the landscape. The route follows the path of an ancestral being, a creator figure from the Dreamtime, who, in the mythological narrative, walked or flew or swam across the landscape during the period of creation, singing the world into being. Every feature of the landscape along that route, every hill, every waterhole, every grove of trees, every stretch of open plain, has its corresponding moment in the song. To know the song is to know the route. To sing the song is to walk the route in memory, to move through the landscape in imagination with the precision and detail of someone who has made the physical journey many times. The songlines cross the entire continent. They do not respect the boundaries of language groups or clan territories. A single songline may pass through the country of a dozen different language groups, and each group knows the portion of the song that corresponds to their territory, knows it in their own language, with their own melodic conventions, their own particular ways of encoding the local landscape features. But the song is, in some fundamental sense, the same song. The same route, the same sequence of places, the same ecological and navigational information, carried across hundreds of kilometers and across the boundaries of cultural and linguistic difference. This means that the songlines function not just as individual navigation tools, but as a continental scale information network. A traveler who knew the songline, who had been taught the relevant portions of the relevant songs, could walk from one side of Australia to the other, following the route encoded in the music, knowing at each step where the next waterhole was, what the terrain would look like around the next bend, what plants were edible in the next region, and what plants were dangerous. The songs were, in a very literal sense, a map, but a map of a kind that no cartographer has ever produced, because it was not drawn on a flat surface, but encoded in the human voice, in the human body, in the human memory, and transmitted from generation to generation through performance and participation and practice. The cognitive demands of this system are extraordinary. To be a fully initiated knowledge holder in a traditional Aboriginal Australian culture was to have memorized, with precision sufficient for practical navigation, hundreds or thousands of songs, each one encoding a dense matrix of geographical, ecological, and cosmological information. Researchers who have attempted to assess the memory capacities of traditional knowledge holders have consistently found recall abilities that are, by any standard measure, exceptional. Not because these individuals were born with unusual memories, but because they were trained from early childhood in a memory system that was specifically designed to encode and retrieve exactly this kind of dense, spatially organized information. The songlines are not just a navigation tool. They are also a memory technology, a system for extending the natural human capacity for memory in a specific direction, toward the precise encoding of large-scale geographical information that is without parallel in any other culture. There is a philosophical dimension to the songlines that is worth considering, because it speaks to something about the relationship between knowledge and landscape that the first Australians developed over 50,000 years. A relationship that is, in some ways, the inverse of the relationship to landscape that has dominated Western thought since the beginning of the scientific revolution. In the Western scientific tradition, the landscape is an object. It is something that exists out there, separate from the human mind, that the human mind describes and maps and analyzes and exploits. The map is a representation of the landscape, a human mental construction that attempts to capture, in a simplified and transportable form, the information contained in the physical world. In the songline tradition, the landscape is a subject. It is something that speaks, that remembers, that carries meaning. The songs are not representations of the landscape. They are, in the cosmological understanding of the tradition, the landscape itself, the actual creative force that called the features of the land into being. To sing the song is not to describe the waterhole. To sing the song is, in some sense, to be the waterhole, to participate in its continued existence, to maintain the relationship between the human community and the living land that sustains it. This is a profoundly different orientation to the physical world than the one that produced Google Maps and GPS satellites. It is not less accurate. It is not less sophisticated. It is differently structured. Structured around participation and relationship rather than observation and representation. 50,000 years of developing and refining and living within this participatory orientation to landscape produced in the cognitive architecture of the first Australians, a way of knowing the world that is genuinely difficult to describe in the categories of Western epistemology. It is not mysticism in the dismissive sense that word is sometimes used. It is a pragmatic, functional, rigorously tested way of encoding, storing, and transmitting essential information. Information about where to find water, how to navigate across vast distances, how to manage the ecological relationships that sustain human life in an extreme environment. The fact that this information is encoded in the language of mythology and music, rather than the language of cartography and database management, does not make it less precise. In some contexts, it may make it more so, because information that is emotionally and aesthetically engaging, that is bound up with identity and belonging and relationship, is information that is far more reliably retained and transmitted than information stored in purely abstract form. We have been circling around the question of the Australian environment, its heat, its aridity, its vast distances and punishing extremes, but we have not yet sat with it directly. We need to do that now, because the physical demands of Australia were not incidental to the story of the first Australians. They were its organizing principle. They were the force that shaped everything else, the cognition, the culture, the social structure, the cosmology. To understand why the first Australians evolved differently from the rest of humanity, you have to understand what they were asked to survive. Australia is, by almost any measure, the most challenging continent for human habitation on Earth. It has the lowest average rainfall of any inhabited continent. It has the oldest, most depleted soils in the world, soils that have been weathering in place for hundreds of millions of years, losing their fertility with each passing geological age, unable to produce the kind of dense, reliable vegetation that supports large mammal populations in younger, more geologically active landscapes. It has temperature extremes that range from below freezing in the high-altitude southeastern ranges in winter to well above 50 degrees Celsius in the central deserts in summer. It has floods and droughts of extraordinary intensity, droughts that can last for years, floods that can inundate vast plains in a matter of days. It has vegetation that is, from a human nutritional standpoint, often difficult to access, high in fibrous material, frequently toxic without preparation, requiring sophisticated processing before it can be safely consumed. The human physiological response to this environment, over 50,000 years of natural selection, is not something that can be fully captured in a single observation. It is a complex, multidimensional set of adaptations that touch nearly every system of the body. But there are certain features of the physiological adaptation of traditional Aboriginal Australians to their environment that are particularly well documented and particularly instructive. One of the most striking is thermoregulation, the management of body temperature in environments of extreme heat. Aboriginal Australians who live and work in traditional desert conditions show a pattern of thermoregulatory physiology that is measurably different from that of European ancestry populations tested under the same conditions. They tend to maintain lower core body temperatures during heat stress, dissipate heat more efficiently through sweating, and show less physiological distress, lower heart rate elevations, lower rates of heat-related illness, at equivalent levels of heat exposure. These are not purely behavioral adaptations. They reflect underlying physiological differences in sweat gland function, cardiovascular response to heat load, and the regulation of core body temperature that are, at least in part, the product of long-term adaptation to the specific thermal demands of the Australian environment. Equally remarkable is the capacity for cold tolerance in desert-dwelling Aboriginal Australians. The Australian desert is not merely hot, it is, at night and in the winter months, bitterly cold, dropping to temperatures that would be dangerous for an unclothed person without some kind of physiological or behavioral adaptation. Traditional Aboriginal Australians in the central desert regions historically slept with minimal or no clothing, in the open or in simple windbreaks, at temperatures that regularly approached or fell below freezing. Studies conducted on traditional desert communities in the mid-20th century found that these individuals showed a distinctive pattern of thermoregulatory response to cold, a controlled lowering of peripheral body temperature and metabolic activity during cold exposure that allowed them to maintain core temperature without the shivering responses that characterize the cold exposure responses of European populations. This controlled cooling strategy, essentially allowing the body to become somewhat cooler at the extremities while protecting the core, is metabolically efficient in a way that continuous shivering is not. It is a physiological strategy adapted to an environment where cold nights are a regular feature of life, and where the metabolic cost of continuous thermogenesis must be weighed against the energy demands of a long day of foraging in high heat. There is also the question of water metabolism. Traditional Aboriginal Australians, particularly those from desert regions, show physiological adaptations to reduced water availability that have been documented in several studies. Kidney function, urine concentration, and the efficiency of water conservation in the sweat response all show patterns consistent with selection for water efficiency in arid environments. These adaptations are not absolute. No human being can survive indefinitely without water, but they reduce the daily water requirement in hot conditions to levels that are meaningfully lower than those found in non-adapted populations, and they extend the physiological tolerance for mild dehydration to a degree that has real practical consequences for survival in the desert. Food metabolism is another area of documented difference. The traditional Aboriginal Australian diet was highly variable in its caloric content, characterized by periods of relative abundance, following successful hunting or the discovery of a productive plant patch, interspersed with periods of significant caloric restriction during droughts or difficult seasons. This feast and famine pattern, sustained over tens of thousands of years, produced selection pressure for what metabolic scientists call thrifty genotypes, genetic variants that promote efficient caloric storage during periods of abundance, in anticipation of the lean periods that invariably follow. The thrifty genotype hypothesis, originally proposed in the 1960s by the geneticist James Neal, predicts that populations with long evolutionary histories in environments of unpredictable food availability will show high rates of metabolic conditions like type 2 diabetes and obesity when exposed to the caloric abundance of a Western diet. This prediction has been borne out with devastating accuracy in the Aboriginal Australian population since the introduction of Western foods. The metabolic adaptations that were protective in the feast and famine environment of traditional Australia become liabilities in an environment of continuous caloric surplus. This is not a moral story. It is not a story about weakness or failure or the inability to adapt to modernity. It is a story about the deep specificity of biological adaptation, the way that evolution tailors organisms to their actual environments, not to the environments they may encounter in the future. The physiological adaptations that made the first Australians superbly equipped to survive in the Australian desert made them, by the same token, poorly equipped to handle the specific metabolic challenges of a Western diet. The same genes that protected against starvation now contribute to epidemic rates of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. This is one of the many ways in which the story of Aboriginal Australian health in the modern era is not a story of biological inadequacy. It is a story of biological mismatch, of a set of finely tuned, elegantly adapted physiological systems being placed, suddenly and without preparation, in an environment radically different from the one they were designed for. We have spoken of the cognitive capacities of the first Australians, their navigational intelligence, their extraordinary memory systems, their way of encoding geographical information in the language of song and story. Now we need to speak of the linguistic dimension of this cognitive evolution, because the linguistic situation of pre-contact Australia is, in its own way, as remarkable as anything else we have discussed, and it tells us something important about the cognitive and social trajectory of the first Australians over 50,000 years of isolation. At the time of European contact, the continent of Australia was home to somewhere between 250 and 350 distinct language groups, a number that varies depending on how you define the boundary between a language and a dialect, but That is, in any case, extraordinarily large for a continent with a total population estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people. This means that the linguistic diversity of pre-contact Australia was comparable to or exceeded the linguistic diversity of regions with far larger populations, of Europe, for example, or of sub-Saharan Africa. In a continent with perhaps 1 million inhabitants, there were more languages than in modern Europe, which has a population of nearly 800 million. This linguistic diversity was not random. It was structured, organized around the ecology and the social organization of the continent in ways that reflect, at a deep level, the specific processes of cultural and cognitive evolution that the first Australians underwent over 50,000 years. Understanding why Australia produced so many languages and what those languages look like structurally tells us something important about the nature of the cognitive evolution that occurred there. The first thing to understand is that the linguistic diversity of pre-contact Australia was not primarily the result of population movement and mixing, of different waves of people bringing different languages and leaving them scattered across the continent. It was primarily the result of in situ linguistic evolution, of single ancestral languages, spoken by relatively small groups of people living in close relationship with specific territories, differentiating over time into multiple daughter languages as geographic separation and social boundaries reinforce linguistic divergence. In other words, the linguistic diversity of Australia was produced by the same force that produced so much of the rest of the distinctiveness of the first Australians: time, isolation, and the shaping pressure of specific environments. The languages that resulted from this process are, from a typological perspective, fascinating. Australian languages, or at least the vast majority of them, which belong to a single large family called Pama-Nyungan that covers most of the continent, share certain structural features that are rare or unusual in the world's languages more broadly. One of the most striking is the elaborate system of noun classification that many Australian languages employ. A system of grammatical categories that organizes the world's entities according to distinctions that are, in many cases, quite different from the distinctions encoded in European languages. Some Australian languages, for example, have grammatical categories that distinguish between things that are associated with particular spatial orientations, things that belong to the east versus things that belong to the west, or things that belong to the uphill versus the downhill direction, in ways that are grammatically obligatory. You cannot say anything at all without specifying, at the grammatical level, the spatial orientation of the entities you're talking about. This is not merely a cultural preference. It is a structural feature of the language itself, built into the grammar, that forces its speakers to maintain at all times an awareness of their absolute spatial orientation, their position relative to the cardinal direction, in order to be able to speak at all. The cognitive consequences of this grammatical structure are remarkable. Speakers of languages with obligatory absolute spatial reference systems, languages that require you to say not that something is to your left or your right, but that it is to the north or the south of you, show spatial orientation abilities that are, in careful testing, significantly superior to those of speakers of languages with purely relative spatial reference systems. They maintain awareness of their absolute spatial position more consistently, they are less susceptible to certain kinds of spatial disorientation, and they perform better on tasks that require tracking absolute direction over time. The language, in other words, has trained the cognition. The grammatical requirement to attend to absolute spatial position has, over a lifetime of language use, produced a mind that attends to absolute spatial position with a fluency and automaticity that speakers of relative reference languages do not develop. This is one of the clearest documented examples of linguistic relativity, the idea that the language we speak shapes the cognitive categories we habitually deploy. And it comes from Australian Indigenous languages. It tells us something important about the relationship between the linguistic evolution of the first Australians and the cognitive evolution we have been discussing. The two are not separate. The languages developed to serve specific cognitive and navigational needs, and in serving those needs, they shaped the minds of their speakers in return. Language and cognition co-evolved in the specific pressures of the Australian environment to produce minds that were, in certain measurable ways, differently organized than the minds of people who spoke differently structured languages. The sheer number of languages in pre-contact Australia also tells us something about social structure. In most of the world, linguistic diversity at the level found in Australia correlates with dense, complex, sedentary populations, with the kind of social and geographic differentiation that produces, over time, many distinct cultural traditions in a relatively small space. But the Aboriginal Australians who maintained this extraordinary linguistic diversity were, for the most part, mobile hunter-gatherers living in relatively small groups across a vast landscape. They were not dense urban populations in which many different ethnic and linguistic communities rubbed up against each other in a small space. They were sparse, mobile, and separated by enormous distances. How did they maintain, over 50,000 years, a degree of linguistic diversity that would be remarkable in any context? The answer lies, at least in part, in the social and political structures of Aboriginal Australian life, in the complex system of kinship, clan membership, and territorial affiliation that organized society across the continent and that maintained meaningful social boundaries between groups even in the absence of fixed settlements or rigid political hierarchies. These social structures, which we will discuss more fully in the next section, served, among other things, as mechanisms for the preservation of linguistic distinctiveness. They created and maintained the conditions under which linguistic divergence could occur and persist, producing, over 50,000 years, a continent-wide mosaic of linguistic diversity that is without parallel in any other region of comparable area and population density in the world. The loss of this linguistic diversity since European contact has been catastrophic. Of the 250 to 350 languages spoken in pre-contact Australia, fewer than 150 are still spoken today, and the majority of those are critically endangered, spoken only by small numbers of elderly individuals, with no certainty of transmission to the next generation. Each language that is lost takes with it not merely a communication system, but an entire cognitive tradition, a set of grammatical structures and semantic categories and ways of organizing the world that will not be found in any other language and cannot be reconstructed from any external record. The extinction of an Australian Indigenous language is not the loss of a dialect. It is the loss of a unique cognitive tradition, a specific evolved way of organizing and transmitting knowledge about the world that took 50,000 years to develop and cannot be replaced. If the songlines are the navigational technology of the first Australians, and the languages are the cognitive architecture in which that technology is embedded, then the Dreamtime, the great cosmological framework of Aboriginal Australian spiritual and intellectual life, is the system that holds everything together. It is the operating system, if you will excuse a very inadequate metaphor, on which all the other systems run. And understanding it is essential to understanding why the first Australians evolved differently, not just physically, not just cognitively, but spiritually and philosophically, in the deepest possible sense. The word Dreamtime is itself a translation, and like most translations of fundamentally untranslatable concepts, it is as misleading as it is illuminating. The original word in many Australian languages, Chukurpa in Pichanchajara, Alkiringa in Aranda, with hundreds of local variations across the continent, refers not merely to a mythological past, not to dreams in the sense that English speakers usually mean, not to a fantasy or an illusion, but to something more like a foundational reality, the permanent, underlying dimension of the world from which all specific physical and social realities derive their form and meaning. In the Dreamtime framework, the physical world is not primary. The landscape of hills and waterholes and plains and rivers is not the real world. It is an expression, a material precipitate, of a deeper world of ancestral relationships and creative acts that preceded it and that continues to sustain it. The Dreamtime is not the past. It is not even the present or the future in any simple sense. It is a dimension that is, in some sense, always happening, always active, always present, always shaping the material world from within and below. The ceremonial life of Aboriginal Australian communities, the songs and dances and paintings and rituals that constitute the core of traditional cultural practice, is not a commemoration of past events. It is a participation in the ongoing creative act of the Dreamtime. It is a way of maintaining the relationship between the human community and the ancestral forces that created and continue to sustain the world. This may sound, to ears trained in the Western scientific tradition, like the language of pure mythology, like the kind of poetic narrative that is interesting as a cultural artifact, but that has no real relationship to the material world it describes. But this dismissal would be a serious mistake, because the Dreamtime framework, for all its cosmological and spiritual dimensions, is also a highly functional information system, a way of encoding and transmitting empirical knowledge about the real, physical world in a form that is durable, emotionally engaging, and practically reliable. The ancestral beings of the Dreamtime are not merely symbolic figures. They are, among other things, ecological information packages. The stories of how a particular ancestral being traveled across a particular stretch of country, what it did there, what it created, and what it destroyed, encode a great deal of precise information about the ecological characteristics of that country. The species that live there, the seasonal availability of resources, the locations of water, the dangers that are present, the relationships between different species and different landscape features. To know the story of an ancestral being is, at one level, to know the ecology of the country it traveled through. The cosmological and the empirical are not separate. They are woven together in the Dreamtime framework into a single integrated system of knowledge in which the same narrative simultaneously conveys spiritual meaning and ecological information. This integration of the cosmological and the empirical is one of the most sophisticated features of the Dreamtime system, and it is also one of the features that makes it most difficult to explain to outsiders. We are accustomed, in the Western intellectual tradition, to separating the spiritual from the practical, the sacred from the scientific, the mythological from the empirical. These are not naturally occurring divisions. They are intellectual conventions that emerged in specific cultural and historical contexts, largely in the post-Enlightenment West, and that we have come to treat as universal features of human thought when they are, in fact, particular features of our own tradition. The Dreamtime system does not make these divisions. It was never structured around them. For 50,000 years, the first Australians developed a system of knowledge that held together what we would call science and what we would call religion and what we would call art in a single undivided whole. A system in which the song you sing to navigate across the desert is also the prayer you offer to the ancestral being who created the desert, and also the ecological textbook that tells you what grows there and what you can eat and where the water hides. The cognitive evolution required to develop and maintain this integrated system is, when you think about it carefully, extraordinary. It requires minds that can hold multiple levels of meaning simultaneously, that can engage with a story as both a literal account of an ancestral journey and as a symbolic statement about social relationships and as a practical guide to ecological knowledge, all at the same time. It requires a kind of cognitive flexibility and associative richness that is, in the specific form it takes in the Dreamtime tradition, the product of tens of thousands of years of cultural selection and refinement. Research on the cognitive capacities of Aboriginal Australians who have been trained in traditional Dreamtime knowledge has consistently found evidence of exceptional associative memory, the ability to link disparate pieces of information into meaningful networks, and to retrieve those networks reliably from a wide range of associative starting points. This is not surprising. The Dreamtime system is, at a technical level, an associative memory technology, a way of linking geographical information to ecological information, to social information, to cosmological information, in networks so dense and so richly cross-referenced that any one element of the network can serve as an entry point to all the others. To be fully initiated into the Dreamtime system is to have your mind structured, rewired in some sense, by decades of engagement with an information system of extraordinary complexity and depth. And this rewiring is not merely metaphorical. It is, we now understand, literally neurological. The experience of intensive memory training, of the kind that traditional Dreamtime knowledge acquisition involves, produces measurable changes in the structure and function of the hippocampus and related brain regions, the neural substrates of spatial memory and associative learning. The minds of traditional knowledge holders are not just culturally different from the minds of people who grew up outside this system. They are, to a degree that can be measured with the right tools, structurally different, shaped at the neurological level by a lifetime of engagement with one of the most demanding information systems that any human culture has ever developed. We have been speaking largely of intangible things, of memory systems and navigational intelligence and cosmological frameworks. But there is a dimension of the first Australians' distinctiveness that is very much tangible, very much physical, very much present on the surfaces of rock across the entire continent. The extraordinary tradition of visual art that the first Australians developed over 50,000 years of occupation. The rock art of Australia is, by any measure, one of the great achievements of human visual culture. It is also one of the oldest. The oldest confirmed rock art in Australia dates to approximately 40,000 years ago, making it among the earliest known visual art in the world, contemporary with or older than the famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet in France. Some researchers, examining certain Australian rock art sites, have argued for dates considerably older, potentially reaching back to the very beginning of Australian occupation, 65,000 or more years ago, which would make it the oldest known art of any kind, anywhere in the world. The dating of rock art is technically difficult and often contested, but the antiquity of the Australian rock art tradition is not in doubt. What is even more remarkable than the antiquity of this tradition is its continuity. The rock art tradition of Australia did not begin and end in a remote prehistoric period. It was an ongoing living tradition that continued unbroken from the earliest times to the period of European contact, and in some communities continues today. This means that the visual cultural tradition of the first Australians spans a period of time that is, in human terms, almost incomprehensible, from the earliest days of modern human occupation of the continent to the present. No other visual art tradition on Earth has maintained this kind of continuity over this kind of time span. The rock art itself shows, over this vast temporal range, a fascinating pattern of change and consistency. Certain motifs, particular geometric patterns, certain animal forms, specific ways of representing the human body, appear to have been in use with relatively little variation for extraordinarily long periods. Other aspects of the rock art tradition show evidence of development and change. New motifs appearing at different periods, new techniques being introduced, new ways of organizing visual information on the rock surface. The result is an archive of human visual culture, a record of how one human tradition thought about and represented the world, that extends back further in time than any comparable record anywhere else on Earth. The styles of Australian rock art vary considerably across the continent. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, the ancient Bradshaw figures, now referred to by their Aboriginal name, Gwion Gwion, depict elongated human figures in elaborate ceremonial dress, painted with a level of sophistication and artistic skill that has led some researchers to suggest they represent a particularly complex and developed phase of cultural life in that region. In Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, the rock art tradition includes the famous X-ray style paintings, images of animals and humans that show not just the external form, but the internal anatomy, the bones and organs visible through the body surface. A technique of visual representation that has no parallel in early European art, and that speaks to a particular way of understanding the relationship between surface appearance and internal structure. In the Central Desert, abstract geometric patterns, concentric circles, parallel lines, wavy forms, encode, as we now know, the same kinds of geographical and cosmological information that are encoded in the songs of the Songlines, but in visual rather than musical form. The X-ray art of Arnhem Land deserves particular attention because it represents a genuinely unique artistic and cognitive achievement. The idea of depicting an animal by showing its internal anatomy, of representing not what you see when you look at a living kangaroo, but what you would see if you could look inside it, requires a kind of visual thinking that is, in Western art history, relatively late to appear and relatively rare even when it does appear. It requires not just artistic skill, but a specific cognitive orientation, a way of looking at the surface of things and thinking simultaneously about what lies beneath, a willingness to violate the visual coherence of the external form in order to convey information about internal structure. This cognitive orientation is precisely the kind of thing we might expect to emerge from a tradition with deep roots in the Dreamtime framework, from a culture that habitually thinks about the relationship between surface appearances and underlying realities, between the visible world and the deeper world that gives it form. The continuity of the Australian rock art tradition also tells us something important about the cultural and social stability of Aboriginal Australian civilization over the very long term. Rock art is not made in isolation. It requires the transmission of specific techniques, specific conventions of representation, specific understandings of what the art is for and how it works. The fact that certain motifs and certain artistic approaches persist in the Australian record for tens of thousands of years is evidence of a cultural transmission system of extraordinary durability, a set of social institutions and pedagogical practices capable of maintaining the integrity of a complex cultural tradition across more generations than we can easily count. This is itself a cognitive and organizational achievement. Building a culture that can maintain its core knowledge traditions across 50,000 years of climate change, ecological upheaval, and the full range of human social disruption requires a social architecture of remarkable stability and sophistication. The rock art of Australia is not merely beautiful, though it is often that. It is not merely ancient, though its antiquity is extraordinary. It is evidence, some of the most compelling evidence available, that the first Australians developed, over their 50,000 years in the continent, a visual cultural tradition of genuine depth and sophistication, a tradition that encoded knowledge, maintained social memory, sustained cosmological frameworks, and produced objects of aesthetic power that speak, across tens of thousands of years of time, to something in the human response to form and color and meaning that has not changed. We come now to the final and, in some ways, most painful chapter in the story of the first Australians' biological and cultural distinctiveness, the story of what happened to their biology and their culture and their languages and their social structures and everything else that 50,000 years had built, when the rest of the world finally arrived. We have already touched on the immunological dimension of this encounter, the catastrophic vulnerability of a population with no prior exposure to the infectious diseases of the old world, the devastating mortality rates, the communities destroyed in months or years by epidemics that swept through them faster than any other force of colonization. But the biological impact of European contact went beyond infectious disease. It was, in fact, a comprehensive disruption of every adaptive system that the first Australians had developed, a mismatch, sudden and total, between a set of finely evolved biological adaptations and a radically altered environment. Consider the metabolic story we have already told, the thrifty genotype adaptations that helped the first Australians survive the feast and famine cycles of the Australian environment became, in the context of colonial settlement, drivers of epidemic metabolic disease. When access to traditional foods was disrupted, when dispossession from traditional lands removed the mobility and the ecological knowledge that the traditional food system required, and when the foods that replaced them were the high-sugar, high-fat, calorie-dense processed foods of the colonial economy, the metabolic machinery that had been tuned for scarcity found itself in a state of permanent overload. The result was, and continues to be, epidemic rates of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and kidney disease in Aboriginal Australian communities. These are not diseases of weakness or genetic inadequacy. They are diseases of mismatch, of biological systems placed, without adequate time for adjustment, in an environment entirely unlike the one they were designed for. Consider the sensory story. The visual acuity and spatial intelligence that traditional Aboriginal Australian life developed were not mere curiosities. They were practical necessities. In the traditional context, exceptional long-distance vision and spatial awareness were skills that had real survival value, that made the difference between finding food and going hungry, between reading the landscape correctly and getting lost. When the contexts that demanded and rewarded these skills were disrupted, when the traditional way of life that had developed and maintained them was replaced by a sedentary institutionalized existence in missions and settlements, the cognitive and physiological systems that had supported those skills were no longer adequately exercised. They were not lost. Biology does not erase adaptations that quickly, but they were increasingly untrained, increasingly disconnected from the contexts that gave them meaning and value. Consider the social story. The complex kinship systems and territorial affiliations of traditional Aboriginal Australian society were not merely cultural preferences, they were social technologies, carefully evolved systems for managing the distribution of resources, mediating conflicts, organizing the transmission of knowledge, and maintaining the ecological relationships that sustained human life in an environment of limited and variable productivity. The destruction of these systems, through dispossession, through the forcible removal of children from their families and communities, through the deliberate suppression of traditional ceremony and language, was not merely a cultural loss. It was the dismantling of a social architecture that had been built and refined over 50,000 years to serve specific functional purposes in a specific environment. When that architecture was dismantled, the functions it served did not simply vanish. They became the unmet needs, for security, for belonging, for knowledge transmission, for ecological connection, that underlie so many of the social and health challenges that Aboriginal Australian communities continue to face today. There is a genomic dimension to the contact story that is less discussed, but equally important. The founding population of Aboriginal Australians, as we have established, was genetically differentiated from other modern human populations in ways that reflected 50,000 years of local adaptation and genetic drift. The population that European colonization encountered was not a single undifferentiated mass. It was a mosaic of hundreds of distinct, regionally adapted, genetically differentiated communities, each carrying its own particular suite of local adaptations, its own particular frequencies of adaptive genetic variants, its own unique contribution to the total genetic diversity of the species. The demographic catastrophe of colonization, the deaths from disease, the violence, the dispossession, the disruption of reproduction, did not simply reduce the population. It destroyed genetic diversity. Communities were wiped out that carried genetic variants found nowhere else in the world. Lineages were extinguished that had been developing in their particular environments for tens of thousands of years. Adaptive information that had been encoded in genomes over all of that time was simply erased. We do not have complete records of how much genetic diversity was lost in this way, because we do not have complete records of pre-contact genetic diversity. What we know from the studies that have been done suggests that the genetic diversity of Aboriginal Australian populations today, while still remarkable by world standards, is considerably reduced from what it was before 1788. What specific adaptive variants were lost, what particular combinations of immune genes, metabolic genes, neurological genes that had been shaped by 50,000 years of Australian life, we will never fully know. The genome, like the languages and the knowledge traditions, was not fully recorded before the catastrophe began. This is one of the great unrecognized losses of human history, not merely the loss of cultures and languages, devastating as that is, but the loss of biological information, of evolved, tested, irreplaceable adaptive variation that took 50,000 years to develop and a few generations to destroy. Each extinct language took with it a way of organizing and transmitting knowledge. Each destroyed community took with it a set of genomic variants that will never be reconstructed. The biological diversity of our species, the full range of its adaptive potential, is smaller today than it was before the colonization of Australia began. There is one more dimension of the first Australians' distinctiveness that we have not yet adequately addressed, and it concerns a question that sounds simple but is, in fact, one of the most profound questions in human evolutionary biology. What does it mean to be healthy? For most of the history of Western medicine, this question has been answered primarily in terms of the absence of disease. A healthy person is a person without symptoms, without pathological findings, without measurable departures from the population averages established by studying predominantly Western, predominantly urban, predominantly post-industrial populations. This definition has a certain practical utility, but it has a very significant limitation. It takes as its baseline a particular kind of human being, the urban Western person, and treats departures from that baseline as signs of pathology, regardless of whether those departures represent actual functional impairments or simply adaptations to different conditions. When this definition of health is applied to Aboriginal Australians, particularly to traditional or semi-traditional community members living in conditions that preserve some elements of the traditional way of life, the results are often misleading in characteristic ways. Measures of metabolic function, immune function, cardiovascular function, and neurological function that were developed and calibrated for Western populations do not necessarily mean the same thing in Aboriginal Australian populations, because the underlying biology is different. Reference ranges that represent the healthy norm in a Western population may not represent the healthy norm in a population that has been evolving under different selection pressures for 50,000 years. This is not merely a theoretical concern. It has practical consequences for medical care. When Aboriginal Australians are assessed using Western reference ranges, they are frequently classified as having various metabolic or immune abnormalities that may, in fact, represent normal variation within their own population. Adaptations that are perfectly appropriate to their biological context, but that fall outside the Western norm. And when their actual health challenges are assessed, those challenges, the epidemic rates of metabolic disease, the high rates of kidney disease, the high rates of certain infectious diseases, are frequently attributed to behavioral or lifestyle factors, rather than to the underlying biological mismatch that is, as we have argued throughout this script, their primary driver. Understanding the first Australians in their full biological complexity, understanding the depth and sophistication of the adaptive systems they developed over 50,000 years of evolution in one of the world's most demanding environments, is not merely an academic exercise. It has real implications for how we think about their health, their medical care, their right to maintain and recover the traditional practices that kept those adaptive systems functioning. The genomic and physiological and cognitive adaptations that 50,000 years produced are not curiosities to be studied from a distance. They are the biological birthright of living human beings who have every right to have their distinctiveness understood and respected, their knowledge traditions preserved and valued, their adaptive systems honored rather than overridden. The first Australians are not, as the colonial tradition imagined them, a primitive survival from an earlier stage of human development. They are not the ancestors of the rest of humanity, frozen in time while other populations moved forward. They are the product of the longest, most complete, most demanding evolutionary experiment in human history outside of Africa. An experiment conducted on a continent that asked everything of its inhabitants, and that produced, over 50,000 years of asking, a set of human beings unlike any other on Earth. Cognitively extraordinary, physically adapted in remarkable ways, linguistically and culturally diverse beyond any comparable region, bearers of a cosmological framework of unique sophistication and depth. They are not behind us, they are not below us, they are beside us, as old as we are, as fully human as we are, and in certain specific, measurable, extraordinary ways, more deeply adapted to their world than any other human population in existence. When the first Australians arrived on the continent of Sahul, they did not arrive into an ecological vacuum. They arrived into a world already populated by an extraordinary range of large animals, the Australian megafauna, that had been evolving in the absence of human beings for millions of years. These animals had no evolved fear of human hunters. They had never experienced the particular intelligence, the cooperative strategies, the long-range weapons, the patient tracking and systematic pursuit that characterized human predation. They were, in the terminology of evolutionary biology, naive prey. Animals that had not yet learned to recognize the human being as a dangerous thing. And the first Australians, arriving from a continent where large animals had co-evolved with human hunters for hundreds of thousands of years, were very much not naive predators. The relationship between the first Australians and the Australian megafauna is one of the most contested topics in paleoecology, and one of the most revealing in terms of what it tells us about the cognitive and cultural evolution of the Aboriginal people. The megafauna themselves were extraordinary. Diprotodon optatum, the largest marsupial that ever lived, was the size of a rhinoceros and moved in herds across open grasslands. Procoptodon goliath, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood nearly 3 meters tall. Thylacoleo carnifex, the marsupial lion, was pound for pound one of the most powerful predators to have walked the earth. Genyornis newtoni, a flightless bird, weighed over 200 kilograms. Megalania prisca, a monitor lizard, reached lengths of perhaps 7 meters. These animals had been the dominant large vertebrates of Australia for millions of years, and they were gone, all of them, essentially, by around 44,000 years ago. The timing is suggestive. The first Australians arrived somewhere between 65 and 75,000 years ago. The megafauna were extinct by around 44,000 years ago. Whether human hunting was the primary cause of these extinctions, or whether climatic changes played a larger role, or whether both forces acted together, is a question that paleontologists and archaeologists have been arguing about for decades. The most recent evidence suggests a combination of factors, that human arrival created a new predation pressure on naive prey at a time when climate-driven changes in vegetation were already stressing large herbivore populations, and that the combined effect of these two pressures was sufficient to push vulnerable species over the edge into extinction. What matters for our story is not the debate about causation, but the aftermath, because the extinction of the Australian megafauna, however it happened and whatever role the first Australians played in it, fundamentally changed the ecological context in which those people were living. The loss of the large herbivores changed the vegetation of the continent. Without diprotodons and giant kangaroos browsing and grazing across vast areas, the plant communities of Australia shifted. Habitats changed, the fire regime changed, the water dynamics of the landscape changed. The first Australians, whatever their role in the megafauna extinctions, were living in a landscape that was, within the span of a few thousand years, substantially different from the landscape their ancestors had arrived in. The response to this change, the way the first Australians adapted their culture and their knowledge systems and their cognitive tools to a transformed ecological landscape, is itself evidence of extraordinary adaptive intelligence. The songlines that now encode knowledge of a landscape without megafauna, the Dreamtime stories that reference these vanished animals, the ecological knowledge systems that were rebuilt around the species that remained after the extinctions, all of this represents a cultural adaptive response to dramatic environmental change that was completed successfully, and that produced the cultural and ecological framework that sustained Aboriginal Australian life for the following 40,000 years. There is something quietly remarkable about the memory of the megafauna that persists in Aboriginal Australian tradition. Certain oral traditions and certain figures in rock art appear to reference animals that, by Western scientific accounts, should have been extinct for tens of thousands of years. Enormous creature forms, behaviors that correspond to megafauna species, descriptions of encounters with animals that no longer exist. Whether these references represent genuine oral memories stretching back tens of thousands of years, or whether they are later symbolic interpretations of fossil remains, or whether they are something else entirely, is genuinely uncertain. But the possibility, taken seriously by some researchers, that the Aboriginal Australian oral tradition may contain memories of events that occurred 60 or 70,000 years ago is itself a testament to the remarkable durability and fidelity of the songline-based information system. If a system can transmit accurate navigational information about specific waterholes across hundreds of generations, it may also be capable of transmitting accurate descriptive information about specific species across the same time span. The human memory, properly supported by the right cultural technology, is a more durable archive than we typically imagine. The megafauna story is also, at a deeper level, a story about the relationship between the first Australians and the concept of extinction. Every culture that has lived for a long time in a complex ecological system has developed understandings of the relationships between species, understandings of what happens when certain species are lost, how their loss ripples through the web of ecological relationships, what the warning signs of ecosystem stress look like, and how to respond to them. The first Australians, who watched or participated in the largest wave of megafauna extinction in their continent's human history, and who then lived for the next 40,000 years in the transformed landscape that resulted, had more experience with the ecological consequences of species loss than perhaps any other human culture. Whether this experience was encoded in some form in the Dreamtime tradition, in the stories and ceremonies that governed the relationship between human communities and the non-human world, is a question that deserves much more attention than it has yet received. Among the most sophisticated social achievements of the first Australians, and perhaps the least well understood by outsiders, even today, is the kinship system, the elaborate network of social relationships, obligations, and classifications that organized every dimension of traditional Aboriginal Australian life, from marriage rules to territorial rights to ceremonial responsibilities to the most basic everyday interactions between individuals. To understand how extraordinary this system is, it helps to begin with a comparison. Most human societies everywhere in the world use kinship systems of some kind to organize social relationships. All human beings recognize categories like mother, father, sibling, cousin, uncle, aunt, and use these categories to define sets of rights and obligations that govern how people interact. These are among the most basic social structures of our species, but the kinship systems of Aboriginal Australians are not the basic systems found everywhere in the world. They are elaborations of those basic systems of a sophistication that has no parallel in any other human culture. Elaborations that classify every human being not merely in relation to their actual biological relatives, but in relation to a system of social categories that extends in principle to every human being in the world, and that defines for each pair of individuals who share the system a precise set of expected behaviors, obligations, and permissions. The specific mechanism that achieves this extraordinary scope is the system of skin groups, also called subsections or sections in different communities, which divides every member of a community into one of a fixed set of name categories, typically 4, 8, or 16 in number depending on the community. These categories are inherited according to fixed rules. A child's skin group is determined by the combination of their parents' skin groups, and they define a comprehensive set of relationships between every pair of individuals in the system. Two people who share the same skin group are related to each other as siblings, with all the obligations of sibling relationship that entails. Two people in specific skin group combinations are potential marriage partners. Two people in other combinations are in relationships of avoidance. They may not speak to each other directly, or may not occupy the same physical space, or may not share certain kinds of information, and so on, through the full matrix of possible group combinations. The function of this system is to create across an enormous landscape and among a highly mobile population a set of social relationships that can be immediately established between any two individuals who have never met before. When a traveler from one region encounters a stranger from another region, the first order of business is not exchanging names or establishing territorial claims. It is establishing skin group membership. situating each person within the shared social classification system so that the appropriate relationship between them can be immediately understood and enacted. The stranger from a distant community is not unknown. They are a particular kind of relative, precisely defined by the intersection of their skin group with your own, with all the rights and obligations that relationship implies. This is a social technology of remarkable elegance. It solves one of the fundamental problems of mobile forager life: how to integrate into unfamiliar social situations quickly and safely, how to establish trust and obligation with strangers, how to create the conditions for cooperative resource sharing and conflict avoidance across vast distances, by providing a universal social framework that, once learned, applies everywhere. And it does so in a way that is simultaneously highly structured and highly flexible. Structured enough to define clear expectations in every possible pairwise relationship. Flexible enough to be applied to strangers from other communities who may have quite different cultural practices in other respects, but who share the same kinship classification logic. The cognitive demands of operating within this system are significant. To be a competent social actor in a traditional Aboriginal Australian community requires maintaining in working memory the skin group affiliations of every person in your social network, together with the specific set of behavioral prescriptions and prohibitions that each pairing with your own skin group implies. For a person whose social network spans hundreds of individuals across a large territory, as was typical in traditional Aboriginal Australian life, this represents a considerable feat of social bookkeeping. And this is before accounting for the additional layers of kinship classification that overlay the skin group system in most communities. The complex genealogical reckoning that tracks biological and classificatory kin relationships across multiple generations, the additional ceremonial relationships that create obligations and permissions independent of kinship, the territorial affiliations that define rights to particular stretches of country. Social complexity of this kind does not develop without cognitive support. The minds that develop to operate within the Aboriginal Australian kinship system are minds that were specifically shaped by the demands of the system and by the training that the system required to perform certain kinds of complex social reasoning with exceptional facility. The ability to track multiple simultaneous social relationships, to apply complex rule sets quickly and reliably in live social situations, to maintain comprehensive social maps of large networks of individuals. These are cognitive capacities that the kinship system both requires and develops, in a feedback loop between social structure and cognitive architecture that has been running in Australia for 50,000 years. This is why researchers who have studied the social cognition of traditional Aboriginal Australians have consistently found capacities for certain kinds of relational reasoning that exceed those typically found in Western populations. Not because Aboriginal Australians have bigger or more sophisticated brains in any global sense, but because they have been trained from early childhood in a social reasoning system of extraordinary complexity, a system that develops specific cognitive muscles through constant exercise to a degree that the relatively simpler social reasoning demands of Western life do not produce. The kinship system is also, at a deeper level, an ecological system. The rights and obligations it defines are not merely social, they extend to the land. In traditional Aboriginal Australian life, your skin group membership, combined with your genealogical affiliation, defines your relationship not just to other people, but to specific stretches of country. The country you have the right to use, the country you have the obligation to care for, the ceremonial responsibilities you hold with respect to specific landscape features, and the Dreamtime stories associated with them. The kinship system is, in this sense, a land management system, a way of distributing responsibility for the ecological maintenance of the entire continent across the social groups that inhabit it, in a pattern that reflects the ecological relationships between different parts of the landscape. To belong to a particular skin group and a particular clan is to be the custodian of a particular piece of Australia, to be responsible for its health, its ecological integrity, its continued presence in the web of relationships that sustain all life there. This integration of social structure and ecological responsibility is one of the most sophisticated features of Aboriginal Australian civilization, and it is one of the aspects that Western ecological management has been slowest to recognize and incorporate. The continent of Australia was not managed by the first Australians by accident. It was managed by them deliberately, systematically, and effectively through a set of social institutions that distributed responsibility for ecological stewardship across the entire human community. And the result, the ecological state of Australia before European contact, was, by all available evidence, a continent in a state of dynamic, managed, sustainable balance with its human inhabitants. Not pristine wilderness, not untouched nature, but a humanized landscape maintained in productive balance by the oldest and most continuously developed land management tradition in the world. It would be impossible to tell the story of the first Australians without speaking directly about fire. Because fire is not, in Aboriginal Australian tradition, merely a tool. It is a relationship, it is a technology of extraordinary subtlety and sophistication. It is, perhaps more than any other single practice, the thing that demonstrates most clearly the depth of the first Australians' understanding of the ecology they inhabited, and the intelligence with which they managed it across tens of thousands of years. The practice of using fire to manage landscape, of burning sections of country deliberately in specific patterns at specific seasons to achieve specific ecological outcomes, is found in many cultures around the world, but nowhere else has this practice been developed with the same depth, the same systematic sophistication, the same integration into a comprehensive ecological knowledge system as in traditional Aboriginal Australia. The Aboriginal Australian practice of fire management, often referred to as cultural burning or fire stick farming by researchers, represents a tradition of landscape burning that has been in continuous development and refinement for at least 40,000 years, and that produced, in the landscape of pre-contact Australia, ecological conditions of a particular character that are now recognized as representing one of the most sophisticated examples of landscape-scale ecological management in human history. To understand what cultural burning involves and why it represents such an extraordinary cognitive and cultural achievement, it helps to begin with the ecology of Australian fire. Fire is a natural feature of the Australian landscape. The continent has always burned. Lightning strike fires, set during the dry season when the landscape is tinder dry, have shaped the vegetation of Australia throughout its history, selecting for the fire-adapted plant communities, the eucalypts and banksias and spinifex grasses, that dominate the continent today. Australian plants did not evolve their remarkable fire adaptations, their thick bark, their lignotubers, their serotinous cones that only open to release seeds after fire, because the first Australians started burning the landscape. They evolved them over millions of years of adaptation to a naturally fire-prone climate. But the first Australians, arriving in this already fire-shaped landscape, did not simply accept the fire regime they found. They modified it. They made it their own. They developed a practice of deliberately set, carefully timed, spatially precise burning that transformed the natural fire regime into a managed one, and in doing so, transformed the ecology of the continent. The specific ecological outcomes that cultural burning was designed to achieve were multiple and interlocking. The most basic was habitat mosaic creation. By burning different patches of country at different times, Aboriginal Australians created a landscape not of uniform vegetation, but of a complex mosaic of patches at different stages of post-fire recovery. Old growth patches with thick undergrowth and large hollow trees stood alongside recently burned open grasslands and middle-aged regrowth scrub. This mosaic landscape supported far greater biodiversity than a uniformly unburned or uniformly burned landscape would have. Different animal species use different stages of post-fire vegetation, and a landscape that maintains all stages simultaneously is a landscape that supports the maximum possible animal diversity, which is, from a hunting perspective, exactly what you want. Cultural burning was, among other things, a technique for maximizing the productivity of the landscape for human food production. But it was more than that. The timing of cultural burns was carefully calibrated to achieve specific outcomes. A burn in the early dry season, when the grass is becoming dry but before the worst heat, burns cool and patchily, encouraging new growth that attracts wallabies and kangaroos to the fresh green grass emerging after rain. A hotter late season burn achieves different outcomes, clearing dense undergrowth that might otherwise become fuel for the devastating, ecologically destructive wildfires that occur when fuel loads build up over many unburned seasons. The specific timing of burns in different landscape types, the specific patterns of burning that left fire breaks and refugia and seed sources to enable rapid post-fire recovery, the specific ecological outcomes that different burning regimes were designed to achieve. All of this was encoded in the traditional knowledge systems of every Aboriginal Australian community, passed down through generations as part of the comprehensive ecological curriculum that every adult knowledge holder was expected to master. The sophistication of this system becomes most apparent when you consider its landscape scale coordination. Cultural burning, done effectively, is not a local practice. It requires coordination across large areas because fire does not respect property boundaries and because the ecological mosaic that effective burning produces must be maintained at a scale larger than any single group's territory. This means that the burning practice of different language groups had to be coordinated, that knowledge of who was burning where and when had to be shared across the network of communities that managed different parts of the landscape. The kinship system, the songline network, the ceremonial gatherings that brought different groups together at regular intervals. All of these social institutions served, among their other functions, as mechanisms for the coordination of land management at the continental scale. What this means, practically, is that the pre-contact Australian landscape was not a natural landscape in the sense of being uninfluenced by human beings. It was a cultural landscape, a landscape that had been actively shaped and managed by human intention and intelligence for tens of thousands of years. The open grassy woodlands that Europeans saw when they first looked at Australia, and that they often described as park-like in their openness and apparent orderliness, were not natural features of the Australian vegetation. They were the product of tens of thousands of years of deliberate burning management. The apparently rich wildlife that early European observers recorded was not simply the natural fauna of an unoccupied land. It was the product of a landscape management system that had been optimizing conditions for wildlife production for longer than any other human management tradition anywhere in the world. When colonial settlement disrupted traditional burning practices, when Aboriginal communities were dispossessed of their land and prevented from burning, and when the careful, patchy cultural burning regime was replaced first by no burning, and then by the uncontrolled wildfires that inevitably result when fuel loads build up unmanaged. The ecological consequences were severe and are still visible today. The catastrophic bushfires that Australia has experienced with increasing frequency and severity in the contemporary period are not simply the product of climate change, though climate change has certainly made them worse. They are also, in significant part, the product of a 200-year interruption in the most sophisticated landscape management tradition the continent had ever known. The fires that destroyed tens of millions of hectares in the summer of 2019 and 2020 burned through landscapes where the fuel loads had been accumulating unmanaged for generations. Landscapes that, under traditional burning practice, would have been maintained in a state of much lower fire risk. The knowledge that could prevent such fires, the detailed, location-specific, ecologically calibrated burning knowledge built up over 40,000 years, was still there, held by the elders of the communities that had been managing those landscapes before dispossession. In many cases, it was not being used. The recognition of this loss and the growing effort in many parts of Australia to restore traditional burning practice and to bring traditional ecological knowledge back into landscape management is one of the most hopeful developments in contemporary Australian environmental policy. It represents a belated acknowledgement that the 50,000 years of ecological intelligence embodied in Aboriginal Australian cultural practice is not merely an interesting cultural artifact. It is a practical, immediately applicable, irreplaceable resource for the management of one of the world's most fire-prone landscapes. The first Australians did not just survive in their environment, they managed it, shaped it, and maintained it in a state of ecological health for an extraordinary span of time. That is a cognitive and cultural achievement that no amount of satellite imagery or computer modeling has yet surpassed. Look up at the night sky from the Australian outback on a clear night, and you will see something that is invisible from most inhabited places in the world. You will see the Milky Way not as a faint smear of diffuse light, but as a great luminous river spanning the entire sky from horizon to horizon, so bright and so detailed that the individual star clouds and dark dust lanes are clearly visible to the naked eye. You will see a sky so full of stars that the constellations familiar from the northern hemisphere are almost lost in the crowd. You will see the Magellanic Clouds, the satellite galaxies of the Milky Way, hanging over the southern horizon like luminous islands. And if you know what to look for, if you have been trained to read this sky the way the first Australians were trained to read it, you will see something that Western astronomy did not formally recognize until the 20th century: the dark constellations. The dark constellations of Aboriginal Australian astronomy are among the most remarkable and least well-known features of the first Australians' intellectual tradition. Western astronomy organizes the night sky into constellations defined by the bright stars, patterns of light traced against the dark background of space. Aboriginal Australian astronomy does something complementary, and in some ways more sophisticated. It organizes the sky into constellations defined by the dark nebulae, the vast clouds of dust and gas that block the light of the stars behind them and appear as dark shapes against the bright background of the Milky Way. These dark shapes, the emu, the kangaroo, the crocodile, the snake, are not arbitrary patterns. They are real, recognizable forms, visible to any attentive naked eye observer of the southern sky, that the first Australians identified, named, and incorporated into a comprehensive astronomical knowledge system of extraordinary practical and philosophical depth. The identification of dark constellations requires a fundamentally different cognitive orientation to the sky than the identification of light constellations. To see a bright constellation, you look for the stars. To see a dark constellation, you look at the space between the stars, at the shape defined by absence rather than presence, by darkness rather than light. This is a genuinely different way of organizing visual information, a different perceptual strategy, and it produces a different map of the sky. The Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition, by developing both approaches simultaneously, by tracking both the bright star patterns familiar from Western astronomy and the dark nebula patterns unique to the southern sky, produced a more complete and in some ways more sophisticated map of the visible sky than any purely light constellation-based tradition could achieve. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the Aboriginal Australian tradition was not, however, primarily concerned with stargazing as an intellectual exercise. It was a practical knowledge system integrated with the ecological and navigational knowledge of the broader cultural framework that served multiple functions simultaneously. The positions of particular stars and star groups in the night sky were used as a precise calendar, a way of tracking the time of year with a regularity and accuracy that was essential for planning seasonal movements, timing ceremonial gatherings, and managing the exploitation of seasonally available food resources. The rising and setting of specific constellations at specific points on the horizon signaled the approach of particular seasons. The rising of the Pleiades marked the coming of certain plant foods. The position of the scorpion in the sky indicated the spawning season of certain fish. The appearance of particular stars above the eastern horizon at dawn signaled the optimal time for harvesting certain insect foods. This was a living astronomical almanac, continuously updated by observation and cross-checked against ecological reality, maintained not in any written form, but in the memories and ceremonies of the knowledge holders. There is also a navigational dimension to Aboriginal Australian astronomical knowledge that deserves recognition. The ability to navigate by stars, to use the positions of stars relative to the horizon, to maintain accurate orientation during nighttime travel across long distances, is a skill that has been developed independently by several human cultures. But the depth and precision of Aboriginal Australian star navigation is particularly well documented. The Southern Cross, the most prominent constellation of the southern sky, serves as a navigational reference point in much the same way that Polaris serves northern navigators. Its position relative to the horizon gives a reliable indication of south. But Aboriginal Australian navigators use not just the bright stars, but the dark constellations and the overall structure of the Milky Way as navigational references, giving them a more comprehensive and accurate system of celestial navigation than any single bright star reference could provide. What is most remarkable about the Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition, however, is not its practical utility, impressive as that is, but its integration with the broader cultural framework. The stars, in Aboriginal Australian cosmology, are not merely points of light. They are the dwelling places of ancestral beings, the night sky counterparts of the Dreamtime landscape below. The dark constellations are the forms of the great ancestral animals that walk the sky as they walk the earth. The emu that creates the emu in the physical world, the kangaroo whose movements in the sky correspond to the movements of kangaroos on the land. The astronomical knowledge is not separate from the ecological knowledge. It is continuous with it, encoded in the same narrative framework, accessible through the same mnemonic systems, transmitted through the same ceremonial channels. This integration means that the astronomical knowledge of the first Australians is not merely a technical accomplishment. It is a cosmological one, a way of understanding the relationship between the human world and the larger universe that situates human beings within a web of meaningful relationships, extending from the ground beneath their feet to the furthest visible reaches of the night sky. The first Australians did not look up at the stars and see a collection of random lights. They looked up and saw a living world, a sky country continuous with and responsive to the earth country below, populated by the same ancestral forces, organized according to the same principles of relationship and responsibility that govern life on the ground. Researchers working with Aboriginal Australian elders on astronomical traditions have consistently been struck by the precision and the depth of the knowledge they encounter. Star positions, seasonal timing, the relationship between celestial events and ecological phenomena, the accuracy of this knowledge, tested against independent astronomical data, is consistently high. This is not a tradition of rough approximations and symbolic generalizations. It is a tradition of careful, empirically grounded observation, tested against reality across many generations, and refined to a degree of precision that served its practical functions reliably for tens of thousands of years. The first Australians were astronomers, not in the Western sense of people who study the stars as objects in physical space, but in a more comprehensive sense, people who understood the sky as a living system, integrated with the living system of the Earth, and who tracked the movements and patterns of that sky with a care and precision that produced over 50,000 years, an astronomical knowledge tradition without parallel in the Southern Hemisphere. We have spoken of the external world, the land and sky and stars and social architecture, that the first Australians learned to read and manage and inhabit with such extraordinary depth. But there is one more dimension of their evolved distinctiveness that we have not yet explored: the knowledge of the human body itself and of the plants and substances and practices through which the health of the body could be maintained and restored. The medical knowledge of traditional Aboriginal Australian communities represents one of the most extensive and, in Western scientific terms, one of the most underappreciated bodies of practical pharmacological knowledge in the world. Developed over 50,000 years of experimentation with the biological resources of the Australian continent, trial and error, observation, multi-generational refinement, it encompasses a detailed understanding of the medicinal properties of hundreds of plant species, the practical management of a wide range of injuries and illnesses, and a set of healing practices that integrate the biological, psychological, and social dimensions of health in ways that contemporary biomedicine is only beginning to rediscover. The pharmacological knowledge of traditional Aboriginal Australian medicine is, in certain respects, remarkable. The Australian continent is home to a range of plant species with genuine bioactive properties, plants that produce compounds with antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, analgesic, and other pharmacologically significant effects. Traditional Aboriginal Australian communities identified, named, and used many of these plants in ways that are, when subjected to modern pharmacological testing, entirely consistent with their bioactive properties. Tea tree oil, derived from Melaleuca alternifolia, has been used by Aboriginal Australians as an antiseptic for many thousands of years. The active compounds that give it its antimicrobial properties, the terpenin 4-ol and related terpenoids, are now among the most extensively studied natural antimicrobials in contemporary pharmacology. Eucalyptus oil, derived from various eucalyptus species and used throughout Aboriginal Australian medicine for respiratory conditions, contains compounds that are now used in commercial respiratory preparations worldwide. The amu bush, Eremophila longifolia, has antimicrobial properties that have been confirmed in laboratory testing, and that Aboriginal Australians had been using to treat infected wounds for many thousands of years. These are not isolated examples. They are representative of a broad pattern, a deep, empirically grounded knowledge of plant bioactivity that was developed through long experience and careful observation, that was preserved and transmitted through traditional knowledge systems, and that has been repeatedly validated in the cases where it has been formally investigated by modern pharmacological research. The knowledge that survives, preserved in the traditions of communities that maintained it through colonization, represents only a fraction of what existed before contact. Communities that were destroyed, languages that were lost, knowledge holders who died without being able to pass on what they knew. All of this represents an incalculable loss of pharmacological knowledge, of observations about the properties of Australian plants that were made over tens of thousands of years, and that will never be recovered. But the medical knowledge of the first Australians was not limited to pharmacology. It also encompassed a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between social and psychological conditions and physical health, an understanding that modern biomedicine has largely abandoned in its focus on purely biological mechanisms, and is now working to recover. Traditional Aboriginal Australian healing was not simply a matter of applying the right plant preparation to the right symptom. It was a social event embedded in the broader ceremonial and relational life of the community. The healer, the Ngankhari in the Anangu tradition, or the equivalent figure in different communities, was not merely a technical practitioner. They were a social and spiritual mediator whose healing work involved not just treating the individual body, but restoring the disrupted relationships between the person and their kin, between the person and their country, between the person and the Dreamtime forces that govern health and illness, that had given rise to the illness in the first place. Health, in this framework, was not merely the absence of biological dysfunction. It was the presence of right relationship with other people, with the land, with the ancestral world. and illness was, correspondingly, often understood as the expression of disrupted relationship, of being out of balance with the web of connections that sustain life. This is not mysticism. It is a sophisticated, functionally grounded understanding of the social determinants of health that anticipates, by tens of thousands of years, the findings of modern psychoneuroimmunology and social epidemiology. We know now, from decades of research in Western medicine, that social isolation, social stress, and the disruption of meaningful social relationships are among the most powerful predictors of physical illness and premature death. We know that the experience of belonging, of being embedded in a supportive social network, of having meaningful roles and relationships within a community, is not merely psychologically important. It is biologically important. It affects immune function, cardiovascular function, inflammatory responses, and the expression of genes involved in a wide range of health-relevant processes. The Aboriginal Australian medical tradition understood this, understood it practically, embedded it in a healing system that treated the social and relational dimensions of health as primary rather than peripheral, long before Western medicine had the molecular tools to demonstrate why it was true. The loss of this medical tradition, the loss of the pharmacological knowledge, the social healing practices, the understanding of health as relational rather than merely biological, is one of the dimensions of the contact catastrophe that is least recognized in mainstream historical accounts. The first Australians were not medically primitive. They had developed over 50,000 years a medical knowledge system finely calibrated to the actual diseases and ecological challenges of the Australian continent, integrated with a social and ceremonial framework that addressed the psychological and relational dimensions of health, as well as the purely biological ones. The epidemic of ill health that characterizes Aboriginal Australian communities today is not evidence that this medical tradition was inadequate. It is evidence of what happens when a comprehensive, evolved medical system is disrupted and partially destroyed, and the biological mismatch conditions we have already described are added to the disruption of the social and ecological foundations on which that medical system depended. There is a phenomenon in the study of oral traditions that scientists call oral history depth, the maximum age of events that can be reliably preserved in a verbal tradition passed down through generations. For most of the 20th century, the conventional wisdom in Western scholarship held that oral traditions could not reliably preserve accurate information about specific events for more than a few hundred years, perhaps 1,000 years at the outer limit, under ideal conditions of cultural stability and regular rehearsal. Beyond that, the accumulated distortions of retelling, the inevitable drift of detail over many generations, the creative interventions of individual storytellers, all of these forces, it was assumed, would erode the historical accuracy of a tradition to the point where it could no longer be trusted as a record of real events. The oral traditions of the first Australians have challenged this assumption so comprehensively that it is now effectively no longer tenable. Not merely challenged it, but demolished it. With evidence so concrete, so independently verifiable, so precisely detailed that the conclusion is inescapable. The Aboriginal Australian oral tradition has been preserving accurate information about specific geological and environmental events for time spans that exceed anything previously imagined possible for oral history. The most dramatic demonstration of this capacity concerns sea level change. At the end of the last ice age, approximately 10 to 7,000 years ago, rising sea levels inundated the coastlines of Sahul, transforming what had been a much larger landmass into the smaller Australian continent we know today. Vast areas of low-lying coastal land that had been inhabited by people for tens of thousands of years were slowly covered by the rising sea, creating what are now the shallow continental shelves visible on any bathymetric map of Australia. This was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a gradual process, but an inexorable one. The sea rising on average a centimetre or two per year over thousands of years, drowning the old coastlines, pushing the peoples who lived on them further inland, transforming the landscape within the living memory of communities that had been settled in those coastal territories for many generations. And then, and this is the extraordinary part, Aboriginal Australian oral traditions appear to have preserved memories of this process. Researchers working with communities along the Australian coastline have collected oral traditions that describe, with specific geographic detail, features of the coastal landscape that were inundated by the sea at different periods between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. These traditions describe particular islands, bays, and coastal features in the positions they would have occupied before the sea rose to its current level. features that are now underwater, invisible from any contemporary shoreline, that could not have been described accurately unless the oral tradition had preserved information about them from the period before their submersion. When researchers compared the geographic details in these traditions with the known bathymetry of the Australian continental shelf, the actual shape of the underwater landscape that would have been above water during the described periods, the correspondences were striking. The traditions were describing real places in real positions that had been underwater for thousands of years. The implications of this finding are staggering. They mean that the Aboriginal Australian oral tradition has been reliably transmitting specific geographical information, not vague mythological impressions, but accurate details of specific landscape features, across a span of 7,000 to 12,000 years. This is not the 100 or 1,000 years that Western scholarship had imagined to be the maximum depth of oral history. It is geological time, encoded in human memory and human voice and passed intact from generation to generation through mechanisms that are still not fully understood. The sea level traditions are not the only evidence for this extraordinary temporal depth. Volcanic activity is another area where Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been found to preserve accurate records of events far beyond the conventional limits of oral history. Several Aboriginal Australian traditions describe volcanic eruptions in terms specific enough to be matched against the known geological record of volcanic activity in Australia. Some of these eruptions have been dated by geological methods to between 10,000 and 37,000 years ago. The traditions describing them are not vague references to fire from the ground or dramatic changes in the landscape. They are specific, detailed accounts that correctly identify the locations of eruptions, describe the character and extent of the lava flows, and in some cases record the impact of the eruption on the communities that witnessed it. They are, in the most meaningful sense available, eyewitness accounts, passed through hundreds of generations, arriving intact at the present, still accurate enough to be confirmed against independent geological evidence. Understanding how the Aboriginal Australian oral tradition achieves this extraordinary temporal depth requires us to return to the cognitive and cultural technologies we have already discussed: the songlines, the kinship system, the ceremonial framework, the deep integration of narrative with landscape. All of these are not merely interesting cultural features. They are components of an information storage and retrieval system that achieves, through social and cognitive mechanisms, a durability that no physical archive has matched. A written document can be destroyed, a library can burn, a database can be corrupted, but information that is distributed across an entire community, encoded in songs that everyone knows, embedded in ceremonies that everyone participates in, cross-referenced in stories that are told and retold in multiple different contexts, is extraordinarily resistant to loss. To erase it entirely, you would have to destroy every person who carries it, simultaneously, with no time for transmission. The geological record is, in this sense, a verification of the cognitive technology. When researchers confirm that an Aboriginal Australian oral tradition has accurately preserved information about a volcanic eruption that occurred 20,000 years ago, they are not just confirming the tradition, they are confirming the information system that preserved it, demonstrating that the songline and ceremony and kinship embedded transmission mechanism is capable of the temporal depth it claims. And this confirmation matters enormously because it changes our understanding of the cognitive achievement represented by the first Australians' knowledge traditions. We are not talking about people who told stories and happened to get some details right by chance. We are talking about people who developed, over 50,000 years, an information system of such reliability and such depth that it has preserved geological data more accurately than any oral tradition anywhere else in the world, across time spans that Western epistemology told us were impossible for human memory to span. The deep time encoded in Aboriginal Australian oral traditions is also, in one more sense, directly relevant to the question we began with. Why did the first Australians evolve differently? Because the capacity to preserve accurate information across 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years is itself an evolved cognitive capacity, a specific achievement of the specific information system that the first Australians developed. It is not a capacity found at this depth anywhere else in the world. It was not produced by accident. It was produced by 50,000 years of selection and refinement, by the specific pressures of life in a vast, variable, ecologically demanding landscape, where the loss of geographical and ecological knowledge, the forgetting of where the water was or what the sky looked like when the last great fire came, could be fatal. The deep timekeepers are not merely custodians of interesting historical information. They are the living expression of one of the most remarkable cognitive and cultural achievements in the history of our species. And the fact that the traditions they carry have been verified by independent evidence as accurate across spans of time that Western scholarship considered impossible for oral memory tells us something profound and still underappreciated about the full range of what human minds, properly supported by the right cultural technology, are capable of doing. In every story about the deep past, there is a temptation to end in the past, to treat what was built over 50,000 years as a thing already complete, to mourn its partial loss and leave the story there, in the stillness of everything that is gone. But the story of the first Australians is not a past tense story. It is present tense, alive, actively unfolding, full of what is being reclaimed and rebuilt and reconnected, as well as what was lost. Across Australia today, something is happening that deserves to be named clearly and fully, because it is one of the most remarkable processes of cultural and biological recovery in the contemporary world. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, in different ways and at different paces and with different emphases, are engaged in the work of reclamation, the recovery of languages, the revival of ceremony, the reassertion of territorial rights, the restoration of traditional ecological practices, the reconnection of young people to knowledge traditions that were disrupted but not destroyed by colonization. The language revival movement is perhaps the most emotionally resonant dimension of this reclamation. Of the 250 or more languages that existed in Australia before contact, a significant number have already been lost entirely, spoken by no living person, preserved only in the recordings and transcriptions made by linguists and anthropologists, with varying degrees of completeness and accuracy. But many others, dozens, perhaps more, are being actively worked on by community members and linguists together, using archived recordings and historical documents and the memories of the oldest speakers to reconstruct and revitalize languages that were on the edge of extinction or had crossed that edge and need to be rebuilt from external records. The challenges are immense. A language is not merely a vocabulary and a grammar. It is a way of organizing thought, a system of cognitive categories, a matrix of relationships between words and world that cannot be fully reconstructed from any external document. What can be recovered from recordings and transcriptions is a framework, a scaffolding on which a living language can perhaps be rebuilt, if enough people commit to speaking it and teaching it to their children. Where language revival has taken hold, where communities have successfully brought a language back from the edge of extinction and established it as a living medium of intergenerational communication, the results are striking. Young people who learn an Aboriginal Australian language develop, through that learning, the spatial cognition and the navigational orientation, and the particular ways of organizing ecological knowledge that the language was designed to support. They begin to perceive the landscape differently. They begin to organize their experience of space and time and relationship in the categories that the language provides. The cognitive inheritance of 50,000 years begins, slowly and incompletely but genuinely, to be recovered. Not because the language alone contains all of that inheritance, but because the language is the gateway through which so much else can be accessed. The cultural burning revival is another powerful dimension of the reclamation story. In Victoria, in New South Wales, in Queensland, in the Northern Territory and Western Australia, in different ways, at different scales, with varying degrees of government support and varying degrees of community leadership, traditional burning practices are being restored. Aboriginal land managers are working with ecologists and fire agencies to reintroduce the cultural burning techniques that managed the Australian landscape for tens of thousands of years. The results, in the places where this work has been most sustained, are already visible in the landscape. Reduced fuel loads, more diverse vegetation mosaics, increased wildlife diversity, healthier waterways. The ecological knowledge that was built over 40,000 years of burning practice is not lost. It is in the memories and traditions of the knowledge holders who maintained it through colonization, and it is being put back to work in the landscape it was designed for. The recognition of native title, the legal acknowledgement established by the High Court's Mabo decision in 1992 that Aboriginal Australians have continuing rights to their traditional territories under their own laws and customs, has created a legal and political framework for the reassertion of the territorial and custodial relationships that were at the heart of traditional Aboriginal Australian social organisation. It is an imperfect framework, limited in its geographic scope and often difficult to use in practice, but it represents a genuine shift in the relationship between the Australian state and the Aboriginal Australian people. A shift from the colonial fiction that the continent was empty before 1788 to the legal reality that the first Australians have always had, and continue to have, deep and constitutive relationships to the land they have occupied for 50,000 years. The health dimension of this reclamation is perhaps the most urgent. The epidemic of metabolic disease, mental illness, and social disruption that characterizes many Aboriginal Australian communities today is not, as we have argued throughout this script, primarily a biological story. It is a story of mismatch, of biological systems adapted to one environment being placed, suddenly and violently, in a very different one. And the most effective interventions, the ones that have produced the most compelling improvements in health outcomes, are the ones that work to restore some of the conditions for which those biological systems were optimized. Connection to country, the ability to spend time on traditional land, to practice traditional activities, to maintain the ecological and ceremonial relationships that connect individual Aboriginal Australians to their ancestral territories, has been found, in a growing number of studies, to be one of the most powerful predictors of health and well-being in Aboriginal Australian communities, more powerful in some contexts than access to biomedical care, more powerful than educational attainment or employment. The body that evolved in Australia heals most effectively when it is in Australia, when it is engaged with the country, the food, the social structure, the ceremonial life that shaped it. This finding is not surprising if you have been following the story we have told in this script. Of course, the body heals most effectively in the context it was adapted for. Of course, the mind functions most fluently when it is engaged with the knowledge system it was designed to operate. Of course, the social organism thrives most fully when it is embedded in the web of relationships, to kin, to country, to the Dreamtime, that its social architecture was built around. These are not mystical propositions. They are the straightforward predictions of an evolutionary biology that takes seriously the depth and specificity of adaptation. The story of the first Australians is not over. It is not a story that ends in 1788 or in the worst years of colonial violence or in the statistics of contemporary disadvantage. It is a story that is still being written by the living people who carry within them the biological and cultural and cognitive inheritance of 50,000 years, and who are, in many communities and in many different ways, working to recover and rebuild and reconnect what was disrupted. The knowledge is not all lost. The languages are not all gone. The ceremonies are still being performed in some communities, as they have been performed for longer than any comparable tradition anywhere in the world. The land still holds the traces of 50,000 years of careful management, waiting to be read and responded to by the people who understand it most deeply. And in classrooms and ceremonial grounds and firelit evenings and long, slow walks across old country, the transmission continues, imperfect, incomplete, but alive. The deep time is not only behind us. Some of it, carried in living minds and living voices and living bodies, is still here. There is one more dimension of the first Australians' evolved distinctiveness that we have not yet given its proper place in this story, and it concerns something that, in the sleep content context of this channel, feels particularly fitting to end on: sound, music. The acoustic relationship between a people and their world. The Aboriginal Australian relationship to sound and music is among the most sophisticated and least studied aspects of their cultural evolution, and it is, when examined carefully, yet another expression of the same deep logic that runs through everything else we have discussed. The logic of an intelligence that developed over 50,000 years in intimate dialogue with a specific landscape, and that produced from that dialogue ways of knowing and experiencing the world that are genuinely unlike those found anywhere else. Let us begin with the instrument that has become, for most of the world, the sonic signature of Aboriginal Australia, the didgeridoo. The didgeridoo, known by many different names in different Aboriginal communities, including Yidaki in the Yolngu tradition of Arnhem Land, where it is believed to have originated, is one of the world's oldest wind instruments. Some researchers believe it has been in use in its current form for at least 1,500 years, with roots that may extend considerably further back. But the instrument's antiquity is, in some ways, the least interesting thing about it. What is extraordinary about the didgeridoo is the technique required to play it at the level of a skilled traditional performer. The core technique is called circular breathing. The practice of inhaling through the nose while simultaneously exhaling through the mouth, using the cheeks as a reservoir to maintain a continuous stream of air even during the inhalation phase. Circular breathing is not a technique that any human being can do without training. It requires a specific kind of neuromuscular coordination, a rewiring, essentially, of the automatic breathing patterns that every human body develops from birth, that takes considerable time and practice to acquire. Musicians in other traditions have developed circular breathing for specific purposes. Oboe players in Western classical music, for example, use it for long sustained passages, but nowhere else in the world has it been developed as the foundational technique of an entire musical tradition, required of every competent performer from an early age. The fact that circular breathing became the defining technique of Aboriginal Australian music in Arnhem Land is not accidental. The didgeridoo is not played in short, punctuated phrases. It is played in continuous, unbroken streams of sound. Streams that can last for many minutes, that shift and modulate and evolve without interruption, that carry within them a density of tonal variation and rhythmic complexity that can only be produced by a technique that permits continuous sound production. The music that results from this technique is unlike any other music in the world. It does not have a melody in the Western sense. It does not have chord progressions or harmonic structure in any familiar sense. What it has is a texture, a continuously modulating sonic landscape in which the fundamental tone of the instrument is overlaid with harmonics and overtones and rhythmic patterns produced by the shape of the player's vocal tract, the position of the tongue, the degree of lip tension, the character of the vocalization layered on top of the instrument's natural resonance. The result is music that is, in a very literal acoustic sense, multidimensional, that exists simultaneously on multiple sonic levels, each one contributing to the overall texture of the sound. The cognitive demands of producing this music at the level of a skilled traditional performer are significant. The coordination of nasal inhalation, oral exhalation, lip tension, tongue position, vocal tract shaping, and rhythmic patterning that skilled didgeridoo performance requires is a feat of simultaneous multi-channel motor control that places significant demands on the nervous system. Players who have mastered the technique at the highest traditional level demonstrate a degree of neuromuscular integration, a coordination between respiratory, vocal, and motor systems that is, in its own domain, comparable to the navigational cognitive integration we discussed in relation to the songlines. But the didgeridoo is not the only dimension of the Aboriginal Australian acoustic tradition that deserves our attention. Equally remarkable is the deep knowledge of landscape acoustics, the understanding of how sound behaves in different landscape contexts, that was developed and encoded in the traditional musical and ceremonial practices of Aboriginal Australian communities. Sacred sites and ceremonial grounds were not chosen arbitrarily. Many of them are located at positions in the landscape where the acoustic properties of the terrain amplify or modulate sound in particular ways, where a human voice or the sound of a didgeridoo or the rhythm of clapping sticks reflects off rock walls or hillsides to create particular resonances and echo patterns. The acoustic properties of these sites were understood and valued, and the music performed at them was designed in part to exploit those properties, to use the landscape as a kind of acoustic instrument, a resonating structure that participated in the performance. This acoustic intelligence, the ability to read a landscape not just visually but sonically, to understand how sound moves through different terrains, to locate and use the specific acoustic features of specific places for specific ceremonial purposes, is another expression of the broader deep attentiveness to the physical world that characterizes so much of Aboriginal Australian cognitive evolution. The landscape was not merely a visual phenomenon, it was not merely a navigational challenge. It was a sonic environment as well, one that had its own particular qualities in different places and at different times, and that a sufficiently attentive human community could learn to read, respond to, and incorporate into its cultural practice. The clapping sticks that accompany most Aboriginal Australian musical performance are themselves acoustically sophisticated tools, the specific woods chosen for their particular sonic qualities, the specific ways they are held and struck designed to produce particular timbres and attack characteristics, the vocal techniques used in traditional song, the particular ways that the voice is shaped and projected in ceremonial singing, the use of chest resonance and head resonance and nasal resonance to achieve different tonal qualities, represent a tradition of vocal training as specific and as demanding as any in the world's musical cultures. Music in the Aboriginal Australian tradition is not an entertainment. It is not a leisure activity separate from the serious work of survival and social organization. It is, as we have already seen in the context of the songlines, integral to the knowledge system, a primary medium through which the most important information is encoded and transmitted. But it is also more than a mnemonic device. It is a participatory technology, a way of creating, through synchronized sound production, the kind of deep social coherence and shared emotional state that holds communities together, that aligns individual nervous systems in shared resonance, that produces the sense of belonging and connection and shared identity on which social cohesion ultimately depends. The neuroscience of music now tells us that synchronized musical performance, singing together, playing together, moving in rhythm together, produces measurable changes in brain chemistry in the levels of oxytocin and endorphins and other social bonding hormones that powerfully reinforce social cohesion. The Aboriginal Australian musical tradition was exploiting this neurobiology. It was using shared sound production to build and maintain the social bonds on which community life depended, tens of thousands of years before the neuroscience existed to explain why it worked. The sonic world of the first Australians is one more expression of the same fundamental truth that this entire story has been building toward. These were people who paid the closest possible attention to every dimension of the world they inhabited, its visual landscape and its acoustic landscape and its ecological structure and its social fabric and its cosmological depth, and who developed, over 50,000 years of paying that attention, knowledge systems and cognitive capacities and cultural technologies of extraordinary sophistication. The music is not separate from the navigation. The navigation is not separate from the ecology. The ecology is not separate from the ceremony. The ceremony is not separate from the law. The law is not separate from the land. Everything is connected in the Aboriginal Australian world in a web of relationships so dense and so thoroughly integrated that it cannot be understood by taking any single thread and following it in isolation. It can only be understood as a whole, as the product of 50,000 years of sustained, intelligent, loving attention to a world that asked everything and gave everything in return. We began this journey with a question. Why did the first Australians evolve so differently from the rest of humanity? And we have worked our way through many of the answers, the genetic answers, the physiological answers, the cognitive answers, the cultural and linguistic and cosmological answers. But perhaps the deepest answer is the one that has been present in every section, waiting to be named directly. The first Australians evolved differently because they were given the gift of time. Not merely a long time in an abstract sense, but a very specific kind of time, uninterrupted time, largely undisturbed time, time spent in an environment that demanded their full attention and their deepest intelligence and their most creative social and cognitive capacities. Time in which there was no outside intervention to cut short the experiments that were underway, to disrupt the slow accumulation of adaptive knowledge, to interfere with the multi-generational processes of biological and cultural selection that were producing something unprecedented. 50,000 years is a very long time to spend getting good at something. It is long enough to develop navigational systems of continental scope. It is long enough to build memory architectures capable of encoding and transmitting encyclopedias of ecological knowledge without a single written word. It is long enough for the body to be reshaped in quiet, incremental steps by the specific thermal and dietary and immunological demands of a particular environment. It is long enough for a cosmological framework to evolve from a simple set of origin stories into a fully integrated system of knowledge that holds together science and art and law and geography in a single, undivided whole. It is long enough, in short, to produce a genuinely new expression of what it means to be human, an expression that could not have emerged anywhere else in any other time, under any other conditions. The tragedy of the last 2.5 centuries, the disease, the dispossession, the cultural destruction, the ongoing marginalization, is not simply a human rights tragedy, though it is certainly that. It is also a cognitive and biological tragedy, the partial destruction, before it was fully understood, of one of the most extraordinary products of human evolution. It is the loss, not total, not irreversible in every dimension, but very real and very profound, of knowledge traditions and linguistic diversity and genetic variation that took the longest continuous human occupation in history to build, and that cannot be rebuilt in any short span of time. But it is not only a story of loss, because the first Australians are still here. The languages that survive are still spoken. The songlines are still sung in their entirety in communities that have maintained them. The Dreamtime knowledge traditions are still alive in the minds of elders who carry them. The genome still holds, in its living sequences, the record of 50,000 years of adaptation and survival and deep familiarity with one of the most ancient landscapes on Earth. The first Australians are not relics. They are living people, carrying within them a living inheritance that the rest of humanity has barely begun to appreciate. We close here, in the quiet, in the deep time that the Australian landscape embodies, the red sandstone and the spinifex and the stars that have been looked at from this same ground for longer than we can easily imagine. Somewhere out there, right now, in a small community in the Western Desert, or on a tidal flat in Arnhem Land, or on a rocky hillside in Queensland, someone knows a song that encodes the location of a waterhole that has sustained human life for 30,000 years. Someone carries in their genome sequences that were shaped by encounters with a type of human being that we have not seen for tens of thousands of years. Someone speaks a language with grammatical structures that produce a mind oriented to the world in a way that no other grammar produces. Someone is playing a continuous note on a hollow eucalyptus branch, breathing in through the nose and out through the lips at the same moment, filling the dark air with a sound that has no beginning and no end. And someone is teaching all of this to a child, slowly, the way knowledge has always been transmitted in this tradition. Through story and song and ceremony and long walks across ancient ground, under stars whose names have been sung since before the ice retreated and the sea rose and the great animals of the old world vanished into the red earth. What we owe the first Australians is not sympathy and it is not guilt, though both of those may be appropriate in their own time and place. What we owe them, first of all, is attention, the kind of slow, serious, humble attention that their tradition embodies and that their story demands. Attention that does not reduce them to victims or to symbols or to convenient illustrations of a story we already know, but that takes seriously the specific, singular, irreplaceable thing that 50,000 years of Australian life produced. They are not the representatives of primitiveness or of noble savagery or of any other category that European thought has tried to press them into. They are the representatives of a possibility that our species reached in one specific place over one specific stretch of time that has not been reached anywhere else. The possibility of knowing a landscape so deeply, for so long, with such comprehensive intelligence, that the landscape and the people who inhabit it become, in some essential and immeasurable sense, the same thing. That is what the first Australians are. That is what 50,000 years made them. And that is what the rest of the world is only now, very slowly, beginning to understand how to honor. The first Australians evolved differently because the world is large enough to hold more than one answer to the question of how to be human. They evolved differently because 50,000 years of honest, attentive, intelligent engagement with one of the world's most demanding landscapes could not produce anything less than something extraordinary. They evolved differently because that is what evolution does when it is given enough time in a place that asks everything of you. It makes you, quietly and irrevocably, into exactly what that place needs. It tunes every system of your body and your mind to the specific frequency of that place. It builds, through the long pressure of survival and selection and cultural refinement, a human being who is not merely adapted to an environment, but who is, in some deep and literal sense, an expression of it. A way that the environment has learned to know itself through the medium of human intelligence and human love. And it does so in ways that the rest of the world is only beginning, slowly and with appropriate humility, to understand. If this story found you at the end of a long day, and if it gave you something to carry into sleep, a sense of the depth of time, the richness of human possibility, the extraordinary range of what our species has been and can be, then we are grateful you are here. This channel exists to make space for exactly this kind of slow, unhurried encounter with the deep past. If you would like more of it, please subscribe, and come find us on Patreon, where every story goes deeper, and the nights are long and quiet and full of the kind of knowing that only comes from taking your time. Rest now, the land is old, the songs are long and unbroken. The night sky over the desert holds more stars than any city eye has ever seen, and the night, for a little while longer, is entirely yours.